Recently, a video has gone viral, which is rehashing the oldest and most tired accusations against our movement, and somehow by extension, our party. I am extremely baffled and surprised it's gaining the traction that it is, and that people somehow find it compelling. So the video in question is called The Nonsense of MAGA Communism. It's picked up massive steam. It speaks to the extent that our movement is such a mystery to people, all right? This whole MAGA communism thing, it's such an enigma and mystery to people that anyone can just say anything they want about us as long as it has cherry-picked stuff that can form some kind of coherent narrative. People will eat it up. They want to attribute us to LaRouche or feds or whatever because we are a mystery to people. The actual theoretical foundation of my perspective, Infrared's perspective, the party's perspective, these are not the same thing, although this video recklessly treats them as the same thing, as evinced by the fact that in the title it says The Nonsense of MAGA Communism and the thumbnail has our party's logo, even though MAGA communism has no actual official status in the party. It is not an official ideology of the party. I will give Brandon the credit of creating a very well-refined, meticulously crafted narrative. It's not based in truth, it's not based in fact, but it is a narrative that has selectively taken things, a lot of different things out of context to form this overarching narrative where, because people have such a lack of familiarity with the classics of Marxism-Leninism, they might have familiarity with BreadTube's presentation of Marxism, right? But not the specific applications of Marxist analysis concretely in Marxism-Leninism. We end up looking like a big mystery. If you were familiar with Marxism-Leninism, we would not be mysterious. That's why people like Paul Cockshott don't call us fascists or LaRouche. Paul Cockshott sees our program, he sees our rhetoric, and they're just communists. Anyone's familiar with communist history knows that we're just communists. But when you have ignorance and a lack of the basic rudiments as far as education is concerned about Marxism-Leninism, we are a big mystery. So people can irresponsibly seize upon that fact and misclassify and mislabel us as things that we're not, and that becomes compelling and convincing to people because of the gap in education about Marxism-Leninism. It is incredibly frustrating because there are plenty of people actually popularizing Hitlerism and fascism openly, and we are actually an alternative to that vector of radicalization that is taking an entire generation by storm. And we've gone to such great lengths to combat that ideology and present ourselves as an alternative vector of radicalization for a generation of people that are inevitably going to be radicalized because of what's going on. And videos like this, by accusing us of being fascists wearing a communist videos like this aid the efforts of the fascist, actual open fascist ideologists, because it reinforces the idea that fascism is such a strong, compelling, and powerful ideology that even the people calling themselves communists are secretly fascists. And all that does is make more people interested in fascist ideology than they otherwise would be. It's incredibly irresponsible to associate a principled anti-systemic position with far-right or fascist ideology, because this generation is inevitably going to rebel against the system in some way. And all you're doing is helping the actual fascists. So you are a fascist collaborator if you're irresponsibly spreading this accusation and this narrative. Finally, I would also like to say a second thing. Right off the bat, the entire premise of this video is as follows. The American Communist Party, although presenting themselves as communists and orthodox Marxist-Leninists, are in fact fascists disguising themselves as communists. And if you look at the history of fascism, you will find that there's precedent for that. Mussolini and the German Nazi Party both hijacked socialistic and revolutionary rhetoric that came from the left and did it to misguide and lead workers into fascism, into support for the fascist parties and system. So people, midwits mainly, people see that and they're like, oh my God, the Nazis called themselves socialists to mislead people, and the ACP is doing that with the communist label. It makes total sense because The ACP, they are not like the Marxists we're familiar with, like BreadTube and ContraPoints, I don't know these people, or Hassan Piker. So they must be doing that again. They are far-right Nazis in the modern age. That's the whole... His video begins with that premise and cherry picks as much as he can to conform to that premise. He's arguing the premise effectively without proving it. Just one problem. There's one problem with that. The one problem with that is that in contrast to the 1920s and 30s of Italy and Germany, America doesn't actually have a left-wing movement. Now, I'm saying a left-wing movement because it just adds insult to injury to that premise, because they had socialist and communist movements, very lively and popular ones, right when the Bolshevik Revolution happened. This was in the midst of the first successful proletarian revolution in world history that was taking Europe by storm. This was the context and the atmosphere that fascism emerged in reaction to. I am not even qualifying the ridiculousness of the premise of Brandon by simply pointing out the fact that we have no socialist or communist movement in the US. I'm saying it's so bad we don't even have any left-wing politics at all. We just have the Democratic Party. If you want to claim that the DSA is a left-wing movement, it's not a party. It doesn't have political independence. It's an appendage of the Democrats. If you want to say influencers like Hassan Piker are the left, Hassan Piker was just at a rally for the Democrats, Bernie and AOC. So the left in America is the Democratic Party. If you believe the Democrats are left-wing, that's fine. You can believe that. But you will be pressed. You will find a lot of difficulty drawing a historical continuity between the left wing in the communist sense throughout history, the actual historical left wing, and today's Democratic Party. I know that the media calls Democrats the left. I know that the Republicans love calling Democrats the left, but they are not actually a force of left-wing politics. And even if they were, even if we were to concede and acquiesce to the ridiculous idea that the Democratic Party and Bernie was the left, and that's a real independent left-wing movement in America, there's one slight problem. Not only is that not even 1% of the zeitgeist that the Bolshevik Revolution introduced to Europe, not only is that not even 0.001% of the strength and power of the left that existed in Italy and Germany, and the widespread popularity and the sentiment and the mood at the time of a victorious proletarian revolution at hand. The Democratic Party is in retreat. The left in America is in retreat. If it exists, according to you, that would have to be the Democratic Party, because nothing else exists that could possibly be called the left that has any significance. But the Democrats are in retreat. How is it logical that we would want to disguise ourselves as left-wing, let alone communists, while in fact being fascist or far-right, when it would just be much more lucrative and sensible for, if you were indeed a fascist or a far-right person, to just openly be that? With so many different charitable, good faith devil's advocate qualifications, how, whichever way you look at it, the premise according to which we are lying about who we are, and we're not actually communists, but we're merely fascists disguising our real views, makes no sense. Why would we disguise ourselves as a fundamentally unpopular position right now when actual open fascist ideology is way more viral, way more lucrative, and way more successful right now in the U.S.? Even if you believed the Democratic Party was the left and that we have a left in this country, the Democratic Party is in retreat. That wasn't true for the Italian socialist and workers' movements on the eve of the black shirt reaction. And it wasn't true for the German left and German communism or even German social democracy. They were very powerful, well-established forces in German politics. Again, that the Nazis and the Italian fascists, respectively, emerged in response to. If we are fascists, what are we emerging in reaction to? The popularity of communism that's gaining steam? The truth is that we contributed to that popularity ourselves. I have been here since 2021 when communism with a capital C was extremely unpopular. And I have been a Marxist since I was 12, 13 years old, studying Marxism almost every single day since then. My whole life is about Marxism. And you mean to tell me that since I was 12 years old, this was all a conspiracy by Lyndon LaRouche to disguise myself as a Marxist and a communist. The square one of just having a rational and sensible critique of us and our movement is acknowledging the fact that we are sincere. You may disagree with the idea that we're communists, but claiming that we are lying about who we are, that we don't believe that we're communists, is just patently ridiculous. You need to contend with the fact that there are other interpretations of Marxism than the one you have. So let's go point by point and get right into it.
On July 21st, 2024, an organization calling itself the American Communist Party popped into existence. With a 2-minute trailer of AI-generated imagery, the American Communist Party proclaimed to be a brand new Marxist-Leninist party ready to wage the fight for communism in the United States. And this seemed to be a formidable enterprise. A letter of declaration was published on Twitter showing a bunch of chapters of the Communist Party USA, the oldest and historically most significant communist party in the US, apparently defecting to the ACP. On the executive board of the new party were the online personalities Eddie Smith and Noah Kredovic of Midwestern Marx, Haz al-Din, and Jackson Hinkle. And the party already had a sleek new website ready to launch. However, very quickly, within the next few hours after the ACP launched, something a bit curious happened. A bunch of chapters of ACP USA who were listed as defecting to ACP took to Twitter to clarify that no, they were not joining the ACP, and harshly condemned the ACP as chauvinists and reactionaries. The ACP
All right, so this is the first claim being made about the chapters. We did not claim that every single member of that chapter, or in every case, the people who own the social media accounts of that chapter, defected over us. What we did claim is that if you read the letter, within the context of the dispute going on within the CPUSA's National Convention, the voices of independence within those chapters. So those who represented the independent will of the chapter rather than the forces of Joe Sim's coup did in fact defect and sign off to this. And we regarded them as the legitimate representatives of their chapter. Why? Because they were the voices who represented their chapter in an independent capacity. We did not say that every single person from that chapter defected. Just like when the Declaration of Independence was signed, not every single person from that state signed that letter. Just the representatives and the voices of independence from that colony signed it. And in that capacity, they represented the voice of independence. So that is what gave them the right to represent the will of the colony, because they were the only force of independence. Everyone else was just acquiescing to the status quo. So that was our logic. It's absurd to expect that every single person and moreover, every person who controlled the social media account would have defected. But yes, every single chapter we listed had legitimate representatives from that chapter defect on over to us, and that much we can prove.
The Communist Party USA, their declaration letter is spent condemning CPUSA and proclaiming it no longer fit to lead American communism. They expressed grievance at how the party leadership rejected their interpretation of Marxism-Leninism and accused the leadership.
This is not true. I don't know why you would lie about this when anyone can just read the declaration themselves. The specific issue is not about our interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. Everyone's free to have their own subjective interpretation of whatever they want. The grievances were as follows. 1, they rigged their national convention and suspended and liquidated the party according to its own constitution. That's why we did it at this time rather than another time. 2, they were tailing the Democratic Party at a time when a huge or at least significant mood within the party wanted them to change course and change their policy and pursue independence. They cracked down on the freedom of criticism against the Democratic Party for years, but leading up to the National Convention, that was when the promise had been made that a spirit of open debate would be allowed to prevail on the question of the party's stance toward the Democratic Party, while Joe Biden was overseeing a genocide in Gaza. And they suppressed criticism, they suppressed democracy, and didn't allow any of those sentiments to be given expression at all. So that was the main context for the reconstitution of the party, at least at that specific time.
Of breaking the party constitution to suppress dissent, and so they decided to go off and make their own party, the American Communist Party. So all this begs the question of what exactly is going on here. There are all sorts of schisms and sectarian squabbles on the radical left, but this situation seems a little different and unique. Even at a surface level, some of the leaders of the ACP are social media personalities with considerable audiences. Jackson Hinkle has almost 3 million followers on Twitter. Eddie Smith of Midwestern Marx has 300,000 followers on TikTok, has 100,000 followers on Twitter. Rev Lascaris has almost 300,000 followers on Twitter. They seem to have a pretty decent amount of money. They're able to rent venues regularly for in-person events. Executive board members are able to regularly go on international trips. These guys are far more well-resourced than your typical communist or self-described communist party. The leaders of the CPUSA apparently disagree.
We were already influencers, so to that extent we had resources because of the money we made from the internet. Now, regarding the thing about international trips, I won't say much, but I will say it's interesting you make the assumption that in all of these trips we are paying out of pocket. I don't know. Could be true, could not be true, but maybe think about it.
Very strongly with their interpretation of Marxism-Leninism, which begs the question of what that interpretation is. The ACP claims that they are the true and authentic Communist Party, unlike CPUSA, but CPUSA members were quick to condemn the ACP as reactionaries, which is a strong claim. Is this just a sectarian mudslinging, or is there any truth to this charge? Let's take a look at the most well-known leader in the ACP, Jackson Hinkle, a former progressive liberal and environmental activist who appeared in a Get Out the Vote ad for the Democratic Party in the 2018 midterms. Hinkle has since taken a radical and interesting turn in his politics. If you take a look at Hinkle's Wikipedia page, it says,
upon opening up the question of what our interpretation of Marxism-Leninism is, he doesn't consult our Constitution, and he doesn't consult our Declaration. He consults the personality of Jackson Hinkle. The ACP was formed collectively by a diverse array of personalities and influencers or whatever, who all had to come together and agree upon a shared principle and a shared interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. To reduce our interpretation of Marxism-Leninism to the personality of Jackson Hinkle, myself, or others, is to reject the possibility that there could be an impersonal principle of collective organization and a shared, common, agreed-upon interpretation of Marxism-Leninism that is not just the personal views of every single constituent member of the founding of the organization. So off the bat, he's committing a big mistake. He's not actually asking the question of what is the party's interpretation of Marxism-Leninism as an organization. He's asking the question of who is Jackson Hinkle on a personal level and what are all the things he's ever said in the past. That's not how organizations work. To found an organization, that's just more than one person or personality. You have to officially have an outlook. You have to officially have a worldview that's institutionalized within the party. Again, these nuances are lost on stupid-brained people who think it doesn't fucking matter, but it does fucking matter when you're making a transition from being an internet personality to committing to a collective organization. It is of fundamental importance to be attentive and aware of those distinctions. Yes, it matters. And I'll explain why.
Says that he's a promoter of something called MAGA Communism and references his self-description as an...
Okay, the idea that the party's official interpretation of Marxism-Leninism is MAGA communism, you look at our Constitution, which states our official interpretation of Marxism-Leninism, and MAGA communism, that phrase is nowhere to be found. Because MAGA communism is not a particular interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. MAGA communism is a slogan and a strategy, perhaps, coined, it's a meme, it's an idea, it's a slogan, whatever, coined years before the founding of the party, which was primarily based in an initiative to create a new dialogue between the American MAGA movement and Marxism. That slogan and that inceptual goal has not been institutionalized or officialized within our party. Our party does not recognize the MAGA movement in any way. We recognize one American working class, and our party seeks a dialogue with the American working class, regardless of whether it's pro-MAGA, regardless of whether it's anti-MAGA. That's our party's stance. The MAGA communism slogan was never even a different interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. It was a slogan we thought was a logical conclusion of being a Marxist-Leninist in the American context, and applying it in the American context, but to investigate the question of what particular interpretation of Marxism-Leninism could possibly give rise to the coining of that slogan is different from just reducing it to the slogan itself. Now, this is a very nuanced, meticulous argument that I'm making that takes a lot of intelligence to just follow as a line of argumentation. But why do I have to sit here and yell and be angry to get people to fucking think just logically and rationally? I know it's hard, but bear with me. Maybe some specific interpretation of Marxism-Leninism could be responsible for a slogan like MAGA Communism. But to say MAGA Communism is that interpretation would be making an unjustifiable leap. And he is not investigating the source, like interpretation of Marxism-Leninism that led to that. He's just saying this is their ideology because that's what it says on Wikipedia. And moreover, is that ideology the ideology of the ACP? Or is that interpretation officiated within the ACP? If so, why has the ACP not adopted that slogan officially? I just clicked some shit I don't even fucking know on my computer, all right?
American conservative, Marxist-Leninist. This just creates more questions. What the hell is a MAGA communism? How can one be both MAGA and a communist? And how on earth can one be both a conservative and a Marxist-Leninist? Let's hear it from a self-proclaimed MAGA communist himself. In an interview on Chinese media last year, which Jackson Hinkle did with fellow MAGA communist Grayson Walker, Walker explained that MAGA communism is just the application of Marxism-Leninism to the particular conditions in America and nothing more.
But the Orient spirit was to try and reinvent or rediscover the meaning of Marxism-Leninism in the American context. We don't see any real contradiction between the spirit of being an American and the idea of communism and what that means for America's working class. With MAGA communism, of course, we can go into this as this show progresses. The contradiction is only apparent. When you dig down to it, what we're doing with MAGA communism is no different than what Marxist-Leninists have done in every successful revolution. It's taking the ideas of Marxism and meeting the working class at the level of consciousness that it's currently at, which today is in MAGA. Now, that doesn't mean endorsing or tailing the most backwards elements of MAGA. It doesn't mean, for example, endorsing everything Trump says or Bannon and so on. But it means going down to the people and learning from them and working with them and trying to advocate oneself as a champion of the people.
And when we talk to thinkers from China who are Marxists, specifically the ones that are Marxist thinkers, they say this is the same thing that Mao did.
And Hinkle runs on this theme, presenting himself as a communist who wants to liberate the American people.
I can see that the policies that Washington, D.C. has adopted and run with for the past several decades since before I was born are actually hurting the American people. Whether it's outsourcing of American jobs, whether it's the hyper-focus on Wall Street and financial capital, reigning above all else, reigning above manufacturing, like good jobs that our people need, whether it's the wars and the foreign policy. It's disgusting what the people who are leading our country are doing in our name.
So that's a MAGA communism. It's just a Marxism-Leninism, but applied to the American context, and with a dash of a patriotism. Phrased like this.
No, not with a dash of patriotism. Here the historical illiteracy and theoretical illiteracy is shining. Socialist patriotism is the standard position of orthodox Marxism-Leninism anywhere in the world, ever. To reject socialist patriotism is to reject Marxism-Leninism wholesale. Socialist patriotism attempts to integrate the revolutionary and progressive history of one's nation with the construction of a working class, socialist, or communist-led movement. That is the standard Marxist-Leninist position, and it has been canonized and officiated in official Soviet textbooks, and it's been standard for a century now. So that's not a dash of anything. That's just the standard Marxist-Leninist position.
It seems like MAGA communists are still fully committed to the communist cause. They're just taking a different strategy and trying to appropriate the MAGA label to win over American workers who are drawn to MAGA and Donald Trump. This is what the ACP likes to portray when they're explaining their ideology to the uninitiated. However,
but the ACP doesn't explain MAGA communism because the ACP is an official organization. It's never spoken about MAGA communism ever as an organization. See, the meticulous difference between the voice of a party and the voice of individual thinkers and personalities is a very important distinction to understand, because not everyone in the ACP agrees with the MAGA communist strategy, and it's not officiated within the party. This is what Grayson was representing Infrared here explained. This is what I've explained more or less. But the party itself doesn't need to defend itself against MAGA communism. This is never going to be done on the party's official accounts explaining MAGA communism. I'm doing this as Infrared right now, okay? It's a very important distinction. And stupid people don't think it is because they like to simplify things, but it's an extremely important distinction, which apparently takes a lot of intelligence to understand.
However, is this really what MAGA communism is? When MAGA communists get tarred with the label of reactionary, when Wikipedia describes Hinkle as far-right, is this just a slander? Are people just
Yes, it's absolutely slander. Absolutely, it's slander.
misunderstanding their ideology? For help answering this question, let's turn to an appearance Hinkle made back in 2023 on the Fresh and Fit podcast, hosted by Myron Gaines and Walter Weeks. Now, if you're familiar with the Fresh and Fit podcast, then you're probably already going, oh. But for those who aren't aware, the Fresh and Fit podcast is a talk show which is known for having certain views about women and relationships, views which have led the show to be demonetized on YouTube. So what is Jackson Hinkle doing on this podcast? Is he challenging their views? Let's see. During his appearance, the conversation steered toward the topic of women. Now, I would show the clip of this exchange. However, the contents of this exchange are such that I am sincerely worried about this video getting into trouble for hate speech. Even though it's not me saying it, I still worry because YouTube has historically taken down videos for hate speech, even if the creator of the video is responding to said hate speech and not espousing it. So for 30 seconds, I'm going to put text up on the screen of the exchange and let you read it. And I'll have a link in my sources to a video file containing the exchange, which you can view and verify that the text I am about to put up is indeed accurate.
Okay, I'll pause it so we can all read it. Now, it's very important. This is the thing where I want you to have the intelligence and conscious awareness to follow through the line of argumentation here, because this is going to be a test of whether you can think critically or not. So Brandon made the claim that, is it justified to call them reactionaries? Is it justified to call the party a reactionary party? Or MAGA communists for that matter. Now, let's break down meticulously the problem with that framing. The party could not possibly be reactionary because of anything Jackson Hinkle did years before the founding of the party. Because A, he did not do so in any capacity of representing the party officially, because the party did not exist at all. And B, for obvious reasons, this should just be a no-brainer, right? The party never, ever communicated any kind of views comparable to this in any way. So off the bat, the framing is wrong to say that the American Communist Party can be penalized. At best, you can say one of the founding personalities of the party has said reactionary things in the past. So let's intelligently and meticulously not let them get away with this false framing. First of all, okay? That's just first of all. That's some background. That's not actually my main argument here. Now, follow here intelligently. Have the awareness, please. Don't zone out. Follow what I'm saying here. The claim is made that what Jackson said here, the deeply offensive things that they've said, where he just acquiesces to what Myron Gaines says, that she has to vote, but under the authority of the manager. So let's actually add some context here to investigate the question of whether Jackson is operating as a right-wing ideological actor here, okay? Now, the claim that Jackson is right-wing because he said this assumes that he himself established the context for the manosphere, for Fresh and Fit, for this type of sentiment, and so on. But in order to understand the vector of radicalization and the strategy Jackson is employing here, we need to know who's who and who's responsible for what. Again, follow me here very carefully with conscious awareness. Before Jackson went on Fresh and Fit, it was already a very popular podcast. And it was very much a podcast with a very large audience that represented the general trends and tendencies and vectors of radicalization the youth or an entirely new generation is going in already. If Jackson is an actor fighting for communist politics and fighting for Marxism and fighting for the revival of left-wing politics, what would be the smartest strategy to employ if he were to go on this podcast and try to actually promote the left or promote communism? What would be the smartest thing to do? Now, you can disagree with Jackson's strategy here. That's completely fine. You can say that what his strategy was not the most effective one. You could say, Jackson, he did it all wrong. You should have gone in there and started yelling at everyone and been incredibly incapable of being normal, and you should have just been totally offended and totally outraged by everything that they're saying, and that would have actually persuaded and compelled the audience to be more in favor of communism. You can think that in your head. I'm not even going to respond to that. I'll let you just think that. I'll let you believe it. But what you're not going to sit here and say is that the vector of radicalization that Jackson is pushing toward is toward the right context is being established, the right-wing context is being established by Myron. What is Jackson saying? I don't know. It's difficult in this country. I've been to other countries. Women are more traditional. Because obviously in Russia, women have voting rights. Jackson's not prepared to sit here and say women should not be able to vote when they can vote in the DPRK, they can vote in Cuba, they can vote in Russia, they can vote in China. It's a ridiculous position. How can he actually maneuver through this situation without appearing weak and thin-skinned and so on, and come off looking bad in front of this audience? So you could already tell he is not comfortable with this. He's saying, I don't know, I think I agree. And I know this because I called Jackson after that, and that was really tough. They put me in a tough spot. And it's not a tough spot because we have a hard time saying we think women should have the right to vote. But it's a specific strategy going on podcasts like this and presenting a position that's compelling to the audience that you're in front of. What's the point of going on this podcast if you're not trying to win the audience in some kind of way to the best of your ability? You could oppose us. You could say that's wrong that you did that. You could say that I disagree with your strategy. You could even say that our strategy is ineffective and critique it. I would be open. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The problem is claiming that our intentions are to promote right-wing ideology. Does this look like Jackson is the one with the intention to promote this ridiculous thing about women not voting? No. He is trying to maneuver himself through a right-wing context already established to present a strong position in front of this audience that's already poisoned by manosphere bullshit. And this is the issue with this line of criticism this guy's coming from and a lot of people in general. Why are you making the assumption that when we are going on Fresh and Fit, this proves that, in essence, we are right-wing actors disguising ourselves as the left? Why are you writing off the possibility? You're not even entertaining the possibility that the reverse could be true. What if we're doing taquilla and sometimes appearing like manosphere and so on to get a foot in the door to promote our ideology, communism, Marxism? What if it's the opposite? What if this thing Jackson's saying out of context, it's, oh yeah, Jackson's far right because he's saying this. But he's already being put in a far right context with the goal of setting these far right, this already consolidated far right audience down a left-wing pipeline. He thinks this is the most effective way to do that. Therefore, he is not an agent of the right. If Jackson just said this ex nihilo, if he just said this on Hassan Piker's stream, if he said this in China or in Russia or in a context where it wasn't necessary to respond to, then maybe you could say he's a far-right ideological actor who has these extreme views that women should not be able to vote, right? But given the context, the only thing that actually makes sense here is that Jackson is trying to do the best he can to maneuver an already existing far-right environment in order to get people on a vector of radicalization toward communism, toward Marxism, toward our position. That this doesn't prove Jackson is far-right. It just proves that he's putting himself in far-right contexts and environments in order to strategically hijack that kind of rhetoric to push people in the opposite direction. I think that's really simple. I think when in an environment when the far right is dominating and the subject are the masses, the subject are these huge volumes of people that find this convincing, they find it cool. That's the most dangerous thing. It's not like this is an ideological thing where they've adopted this as a theory. They see this and it makes sense to them and they find it cool. So you have to win them. Now, there's a lot of people who live in bubbles on college campuses and don't think it's important to win this generation that the far right is dominating. And a lot of leftists will go as far as to say that they're just settlers and there's no hope for them, so we should just huddle together in our college campus and call everyone a fascist bigot. You can actually have that position and present it to me. I think it's stupid. I'll disagree with it. But you can't say that just because we reject that view and that we're actually trying to push people into an alternative pipeline and vector of radicalization, that this means we are responsible for the dominance of the far right ourselves. We are not responsible for the dominance of the far right and for far right ideas. That is the situation and the context that is being forced upon us and everyone else that we have to work inside. Now, look, let me be very clear about this. This was one of the most inflammatory and offensive things Jackson has ever said, period. You have to weigh this up against everything else he said, and you have to weigh it up against my appearance on Fresh and Fit. When I was surrounded by women, at the time I was in a relationship, so I was being especially tame and especially professional, and you have to weigh that against what I said on that podcast and how I behaved. You have to not present a one-sided picture where you're cherry-picking the most offensive and inflammatory thing Jackson has ever said and saying that that is the essence of the American Communist Party. You have to actually have everything. You have to present the full context and let people come to their own conclusions. That's not what Brandon did. Brandon took one of the most offensive and inflammatory things Jackson has ever said, and he's trying to make it seem like that represents our official ideology or interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. That's just extremely dishonest. This is just an extremely manipulative thing to do because you're trying to craft this narrative where people only have so much time to see what this whole thing is about, and you're just cherry-picking these things out of context and falsely presenting these as the essence of everything we believe. There are dozens and dozens of hours of footage of us streaming, of us appearing on things like this, and you are going out of your way. How do you actually choose a general representation of what we're about? You should choose the things that actually explain the recurring themes in our rhetoric. Choose the things that actually represent not the exception, but the norm. This video did not do that, as you'll see. So I think that covers the entirety of Jackson bashing he engages in here, but let's see.
So that appears to be one of the founders of the ACP, espousing views on women which are pretty reprehensible. This is a major red flag, to say the least. The communist movement has historically been feminist, and yet Hinkle appears to...
It's not, okay? The communist movement has not been historically feminist, because the word feminism has been routinely denounced and critiqued by every single communist state in the 20th century. The thinkers of the woman's question rejected feminism as bourgeois. Feminism as a phenomena was rejected in the Warsaw Pact as a bourgeois phenomena that was coming from the West. Now, did communists maintain a notion of women's equality? Of course they did. But that's not the same as feminism. Feminism is a very specific movement that does not intrinsically unite the woman's struggle with the class struggle as one and the same thing. The reason that's important is because feminism carries a lot more baggage. Feminism, for example, tries to overturn almost all of the norms of gender relationships and critique those on the basis of the patriarchy or whatever. Communists rejected that. Communists didn't reject all gender norms. They associated certain habits and cultural norms as part of the capitalist past, sure. For example, prostitution, the sex industry, and also the notion that women were the property of their husbands and couldn't pursue their own careers. But in general, this is a terrible truth, I'm sure, and I can show you the proof right now. Communists also did associate womanhood with motherhood. Fundamentally, actually. I can pull up Lenin himself doing this. So let's see. Lenin, this is his interview with Clara Zetkin, the woman's question. So look at Lenin talking about, for example, what he thinks women should be doing as far as the woman's question and so on, and his rejection of this kind of free love nonsense, right? So Lenin, he's here rejecting the way the young people are rejecting all sexual morality. He says the youth movement is attacked with the disease of modernity, right? And they can easily contribute to overexcitement and exaggeration in sexual life. You must fight against that. There are not a few points of contact between the women's and youth movements. Our women comrades must work together systematically with the youth. That is a continuation, an extension, and exaltation of motherliness from the individual to the social sphere. And all the awakening of social life and activity of women should be encouraged, so they should be allowed to pursue careers. They should be allowed to participate in public life. But even in the way Lenin frames the liberation of women from the strictly private context of family life to the social sphere, he calls it an extension, exaltation of motherliness. So women can take on motherly roles in social contexts to help nurture better societal social environments, right? So that was the type of rhetoric Lenin used, for example. That is not a feminist type of rhetoric. Okay, because according to feminists, that's a patriarchal logic. You can disagree with Lenin, that's fine. You can say Lenin was a product of his time and he was backward and we're more progressive now. I don't care. I have a problem with framing such a notion as inherently reactionary or antithetical with Marxism.
Not just sick, but a radical, extreme misogynist, and we can assume by the fact that Hinkle remains on the executive board and that seemingly no one in the party takes any issue with this.
Yeah, but how in practice is Jackson a radical misogynistic in practice? Notice I emphasize that word, in practice. Evo Morales said that he is the type of feminist who likes to tell sexist jokes. Is he a misogynist? In terms of policy, he literally calls himself a feminist. Yet on a personal level, he says misogynistic, inflammatory, and offensive things about women. So Jackson clearly has said offensive and inflammatory things about women in his personal capacity. How does that make him, on a social and ideological level, a misogynist? That conflates the principle of politics with personal banter and nonsense, personal humor, personal discourse, right? That is mainly done to make yourself more relatable on a parasocial level, more likable on an individual level as a personality. But when it comes to the institutional question of the women's question, never once has Jackson proposed to us as the executive board that we should advocate for stripping women of their independent right to vote. And the absurdity of this notion reaches its high point upon examination of the fact that if you read our party constitution, when we are given unlimited power to determine the role of women on an institutional level, which is within our party, what have we done? We have institutionalized an absolute principle of women's equality. In practice, we have institutionalized the equality of our women comrades. Where is the actual misogyny in practice? When have in our own party women been discriminated against because they're women? But because Jackson engaged in inflammatory, unserious rhetoric years before the founding of the party, that is somehow misogynistic, that our party as a whole is misogynistic, that is completely warped, bizarre, illogical nonsense. Just meticulously think about and break down the chain of reasoning that is being employed by Brandon here. And you tell me if it holds up to the bare minimal scrutiny of criticism.
This is a permitted opinion in the ACP. In fact, here's a woman named Slava who is in the Politburo of the ACP, appearing to affirm these views. She doesn't appear to be bothered by Hinkle's views on women because she seems to largely agree. So again, these views...
Hold on, but we did not order Slava to say this. Slava was expressing her personal view. This is her personal view about women in general. It's her own. It's not, where has our party institutionalized this view? What's crazy? Even what she said here was the same thing Lenin said in his conversation with Clara Zetkin, where he talked about the exaltation and extension of motherliness from the individual realm to the social realm. So this is not the same thing as saying you don't think women should vote. It's not the same thing. Also, Slava is allowed to have her own opinion. We didn't restrict Slava's ability to voice her views on this question. Slava is one of our female comrades within the party who is entitled to her own view on the matter. You're effectively saying that women should not be able to have opinions on women? What are you even saying at this point?
Here's a woman named Lavla Jalili, who is in the Politburo of the ACP, appearing to affirm these views. She doesn't appear to be bothered by Hinkle's views on women because she seems to largely agree. These views are entirely accepted within the ACP. I'll give another example of a...
These views have no existence within the ACP. They're not accepted within the party because they don't exist within the party. There is no discourse within the party that advocates for women to have less rights than men on an institutional or political level.
To do with Eddie Smith, Midwestern Marx. Last year, Smith went on the podcast of the far-right online personality.
Someone like Jake Shields is literally not only someone who has a large following of people being converted to the far-right ideology, he himself is a textbook example of a normal person who got converted into this pipeline and this far-right vector of radicalization, who is also open-minded to us and is giving us a chance to push back on a lot of the things he believes and present an alternative vector of radicalization. Now, Jake Shields is not in a fascist organization. He's not there is no Nazi movement in the U.S. right now. He's not part of some kind of fascist phenomena that actually exists tangibly within politics. But you know what? That means, according to Brandon, we are less guilty than the Communist Party of Germany. Because what the Communist Party of Germany used to do is actually send communist representatives to Nazi party meetings to disseminate communist views among actual Nazis. And Eddie going on Jake Shields' podcast is less of a crime than that, because Jake Shields isn't even part of an actual fascist organization. He's just an MMA fighter who has really far-right views. So should we just sit by and allow the vector of radicalization to go in the far right without us intervening in any kind of way and then complaining about how bad and fascist everyone else is? Or should we make a concentrated effort to actually win people over to our position and provide an alternative vector of radicalization?
Holocaust denier and Nazi sympathizer, and he's pretty open about this, but Smith felt it was fine to go on his podcast for a friendly chat.
It's not just a friendly chat, dude. Eddie is making a concentrated effort to provide an alternative, and you're not doing that. And if we don't provide an alternative, you're going to guarantee the success of the far right. This is the problem with people who do not study history, and they don't study the official positions of the Comintern, and they don't study the official positions of communist parties, specifically during the period of the 1930s and 1920s, when fascism was an ascendant phenomena. The communist position was absolutely not to ignore the rise of fascist ideology and have a hands-off view. It was absolutely to initiate a dialogue, to dissuade people from fascist ideology, to present communism as a rightful alternative. The writings of Dimitrov, the writings of Ernest Talman, the writings of Antonio Gramsci, they all reflect this consistent theme. Clara Zetkin herself, remarking upon the rise of fascism in Italy, they all write about the importance of communists to actually counteract fascist propaganda by winning over the masses that are the target audience of the fascists. Communist parties are not without responsibility for the fact that even within the proletariat, there are disillusioned people who throw themselves into the arms of fascism. These parties have been insufficiently vigorous, their initiatives lacking in scope, and their penetration of the masses inadequate. So this is what she says. The petty bourgeois and intermediate social forces at first relate between the powerful historical camps. When the proletariat has abandoned the goal of carrying revolution further, and it's withdrawing from the battlefield under the influence of reformist leaders, like Hassan Piker, who tells us to tail the Democrats, out of fear of revolution and respect for capitalists, at this point the broad fascist masses find their way to the spot where most of their leaders were, consciously or unconsciously, from the very start, on the side of the bourgeoisie. What is Clara Zetkin saying? If we don't go and make a concentrated effort to speak to masses of people who would indeed otherwise go to fascism, like Jake Shields, some who even have already, we have no one to blame but ourselves. There's a really dangerous sentiment that exists among self-proclaimed anti-fascists. And the dangerous sentiment goes as follows. If the masses are won over to the far right, this means the masses are bad, and we need to declare war on the masses. This is an extremely dangerous line of reasoning, because the masses determine everything. And if you abandon the fight for this generation and for the masses, you are a fascist collaborator yourself. And that was actually the Comintern position in the 30s, which regarded Trotskyists who rejected patriotism, who rejected nations, who espoused all manner of antisocial positions that embarrassed the communist movement. They regarded them as fascist collaborators who were throwing the masses into the arms of fascism. That's what Dimitrov said directly. And that is what Brandon is doing here in this video.
complained about cancel culture, and that while he may not agree with all of Jake Shields' views, he still respects Shields on a personal level. So thus far, we've seen that extreme—
So how is the personal the same as the political? The same directly? That's ridiculous. You mean to tell me you don't have family members or coworkers or people in your personal life that have extremely contemptible political views? I'm sorry, but you're just not a normal person. You're living in a bubble or a cult where everyone around you is within the range of acceptable views. I'm sorry to tell you, but if you're a working class person in this country, you have coworkers who are flirting with the rehabilitation of Hitler. Absolutely. You have crazy conspiracy theorists talking about Jews and the Illuminati, and that is the norm if you're actually in the working class. Even if you just work at a Taco Bell, there's a guy at Taco Bell who is sipping lean and smoking pot and is talking about how Hitler was fighting aliens or some shit. And to claim that you can cancel all of those people fundamentally excises you from the possibility of ever being able to relate to people normally.
Misogyny and fraternizing with Nazis are totally allowed within the ACP. I'll give another red flag. This one is—
No, there's no fraternizing with Nazis because Jake Shields is not actually a Nazi because he's not part of a Nazi organization or party. He's not an active Nazi. He is an MMA fighter who has views that can be called Nazi. He has opinions and he has an outlook contaminated by the disease of Nazism. Absolutely he does. But to say that he's a Nazi implies he's an active Nazi. It implies politically he's a Nazi. That's not the same thing. No one is fraternizing with Nazis. Eddie is trying to relate to him as another MMA fighter to dissuade him from his far-right views, to open a new and alternative vector of radicalization. You can't do that if you aren't personable. If you're not relatable on a personal level, why would anyone who got sucked into far-right ideology because of ignorance and lack of education ever deign to even open the possibility of listening to you? Preemptively declaring war on everyone who's been misled by far ideology to be your personal enemy is a recipe for guaranteeing and facilitating the success of far-right ideology. I promise you.
Perhaps not as alarming as having friendly chats with Nazis, but it's still pretty indicative. There's a fake research collective called RTSG Research, which is associated with ACP and run by Rev Lascaris.
How is it associated with ACP? Again, it's an extremely reckless thing to say. When has there ever been an official collaboration between the American Communist Party as an institution and RTSG? Again, I know that for some people this is too technical, but again, you need to start taking these distinctions seriously. When they're saying this about our party, they're implying that the collective principle of our party organization has somehow been applied or manifested in a way that it has not.
Twitter argument, Lascaris tweeted, "I own suits worth more than your monthly rent. Please put the fries in the bag, bro." Is an odd statement to come from one of the leaders of an allegedly communist party.
Right, but you're missing the context of when he is being called jobless and when he is being accused of being broke and jobless by another leftist. And the pride that Rev is espousing is a working class pride. Because believe it or not, Rev is a trucker. And no, he doesn't own his own vehicle either. He's an employee trucker, wage worker, who's being accused of being unemployed to humiliate him and degrade him because of his class position. So he's lashing out, as all working people do, when people attempt to humiliate them because of their class status. So there's nothing odd about his response at all when you actually look at the context, which you very conveniently omitted. Isn't that incredible how you omitted that? You omitted the person calling him jobless and broke.
For another red flag, we can turn to Haz's Twitter account, where he pinned a thread which begins with, "Why Marxism is not woke."
Okay, read the thread and tell me what the red flag is. Actually confront the content of my arguments and explain how it proves that there's something fishy going on, rather than everything literally being on the table. Even in this thread, you have a pretty thorough breakdown of where I'm coming from philosophically. There's nothing being disguised. There's no suspicious anything. It's all being laid out in the open for anyone curious to see. Why this person is very carefully attempting to craft a narrative according to which we are presenting ourselves as normal communists, but look at all these fishy things. Clearly something sus is going on. One, everything we believe is on the surface. We're not hiding anything. 2, you are presuming that you are in a position of authority to know what a normal communist is. I want to know where that presumption comes from. Why are you pretending like you would know what communists look like and appear like, when there has been no communist movement of any significance in the country you live in for at least 5 decades before you were born? How would you know what a normal, non-sus, non-red flag communist even looks like? From what position of authority and experience and knowledge are you coming from? You're not familiar with the rudiments of Marxist-Leninist classics. You are not familiar with the rudiments of the actual history of the Communist Party USA, which I'll get into as the video progresses. You're not familiar with any of these things, and yet you're speaking from a position of pretension and authority as if, I know what real communism is, I know what real communist movements look like, and compared to that, this is very Wait a second, that baseline presumption that you have knowledge and you are familiar with what ordinary communists are like needs to undergo a little bit of scrutiny. Where is that coming from?
Above a long, opaque manifesto where Haas explains his interpretation of Marxist theory. Throughout this thread, Haas cites the Russian philosopher Alexandr Dugin. This is very curious because Dugin, who I'll be talking more about later, is a...
Hold on. This is literally a logical fallacy. It's not curious if you're not even reading what I say or write about Dugin. Why am I citing him? I provide reasoning for that, Brandon. Why are you not interrogating the meticulous, well-crafted reasoning I employ and instead pulling up his Wikipedia and saying this is really strange, but you're not even deigning to make an effort to understand in what way I cite him? There's something really illogical and pathological about that. This is this guy and his name and his face and a bunch of lies Wikipedia says about him. Therefore, something sus is going on. I have read Dugin myself, though. I cite Dugin's ideas. I very specifically talk about in what ways Dugin has relevance in that thread. You don't interrogate with any of that. You just pull up his Wikipedia page, which, again, midwit bystanders coming across this video might find compelling. But again, it's not a position that is a result of the use of reason. It's extremely pathological.
Far-right philosopher. Now, I don't think it's wrong to read and engage with a right-wing...
Why are you reading Wikipedia when the subject in contention is my views and my interpretation of Marxism, instead of reading me directly, where you're not even clicking any of these things, you're just scrolling past it and dismissing it because why? I mentioned someone's name? And therefore, all of the bad associations you have with that name are justified, and you can apply them to me, and I can somehow be accused of being a fascist because of your ignorance. You haven't even read a fucking word of Dugin in your life. I can almost guarantee that, by the way. You've never opened one of his books and actually read them. Where is the presumptuousness that you are an authority on Dugin coming from? Because you've read his Wikipedia?
Philosophers, but Haas does more than that. Haas utterly adores Dugin, and so does Jackson Hinkle. He also adores...
Again, you just pulled up a thread where I very painstakingly elaborate upon what Dugin's relevance is for Marxism according to me. And instead of engaging with that in any kind of way, you accuse me of this nebulous adoration of Dugin, resorting to personal terms rather than a principled theoretical breakdown or theoretical critique.
Why are two leaders of the American Communist Party such a...
Why? It's such a big mystery. If only there wasn't something pinned on Haas's fucking Twitter profile that you just fucking pulled up that would fucking explain it. What a fucking mystery, right? If only I didn't have countless of fucking hours of lectures plus something you just fucking pulled up fucking explaining it. What a big fucking mystery! You fucking idiot! How is it not so blatantly obvious how fucking stupid it is? I literally break down theoretically Dugin's significance and why I think he's an important thinker, and this guy's making it seem like it's some secret mystery that could only be explained by this notion that I'm secretly a fascist. I've written about it on my Substack. I've gone into various lectures about it. I fucking explained it in the very thread he pulled up, proving that he was at least familiar with the fact that I made an effort to explain it. Why is he treating it like some secret mystery that I'm hiding from the world? but my anger comes from the fact that I'm the only one who gets angry about it. I just want someone to be 1% as angry as I am towards stupidity like this, and you will see how much that does wonders for my fucking mental health and my ability to take a fucking chill pill.
A far-right philosopher. And I'll give yet another red flag. Back in December, the ACP held an event where the party platform was introduced by Haas. You'll recall that the ACP launched last July, which means that all the way from July to December, the ACP lacked a formal platform. This is a bit curious. A platform is important, and this only further fueled the suspicions of the ACP's ideological character.
Brandon, the inceptual premise of a party and a collective organization isn't actually a platform. It's actually a commitment to collective discipline on the basis of the construction of a party for the working class. There's nothing suspicious about the fact that we didn't officiate our program until months after the launch of the party. Given the fact that we were a reconstitution of the CPUSA, that we were a nascent party that had declared and announced its existence, and the simple and obvious fact that the square one premise of a communist party isn't actually having a readily made platform, but having the bare minimum of a commitment to build an organization for the working class. It's practical commitment that's the foundation of a party, not a platform. Programs are adopted very early on, but they are not the foundation of an organization at all, and they never have been in history.
If the ACP were to theoretically come to power in America, what would they actually do? What are their policies? What is their program? Haas sought to dispel all the naysayers, presenting a platform which overall seems actually pretty decent. Cancel all debts, universal healthcare and education and housing, ending U.S. imperialism. This is the stuff you would expect.
Right, but that doesn't matter. What matters is Lyndon LaRouche, right? Not what we actually say and how we actually... I just want to know this. If ACP is lying about what it is, why are you assuming that in all of the cases where you're trying to cancel us that we're telling the truth? Like, for example, if you find me a clip praising that LaRouche was great at making up policies, why aren't I lying there? How do you know what's the truth and what's not the truth? Whatever just conveniently fits your narrative? Think about the line of argumentation here. Think about the actual claim being made and the premises necessary to prove that claim. You are saying that we're lying about who we are. How do you pick and choose who's telling the truth? Again, the idea we're fascists in disguise, lying about who we are, and adopting a communist disguise doesn't make any sense because it's a really shitty disguise. And the circumstances and the context we're living in do not lend themselves to that disguise getting us anywhere.
A communist or socialist party program? I guess we were wrong. It turns out the ACP is a genuine communist party. We were just being hysterical.
No, that's literally the truth. That is actually the truth. It is going to be incredible to witness the mental gymnastics of this person trying to deny this just self-evident and basic reality.
Wait, let's take a look at the description. So far, everything seems good. Then, well, what's this? Promote American civilization. Reconstitute the USA into one united republic. What exactly does this mean? Here.
What does it mean? If only there was a fucking speech up where you could click the timestamp and learn about what it means. If only we actually had a program on our website that actually explains what that means. Again, this guy is like pretending to be like Scooby-Doo, like he's some kind of investigative journalist, pretending that things are mysteries that are not mysteries. I would love to see what interpretation he's just relying on, which is true. It's just the sad truth. Most people are not going to go to acp.us/program. Most people are not going to find this video and click the timestamp for themselves. They're just going to lazily sit back, smoke pot, eat Dorito chips, and take whatever this guy says at face value because it's just convenient for them, because they want to believe whatever he has to say.
Haas makes a curious reference to Canada.
We all love our country, which we know as the United States of America, though some of you live in Canada. It's just, what's the point of getting angry? What's the point? It's also tiresome. Yeah, it is. Curious reference. Very curious. It's really curious. It's like something we're trying to hide. It's really like a little sus. It's a clue. It's like he's a detective and that was just a clue. And he's uncovering something. Where we say in our Constitution that the territory encompassed by the United States and Canada is one nation and we are the party, the legitimate communist party within that territory. And it's in our Constitution. And he thinks it's curious. He had to find this remark that everyone understood because of our overt commitment to building one communist party that encompasses Canada and the USA. And he's trying to make it seem like we're concealing some secret LaRouche, like we're all double agents and we're all going home as LaRouche. We take off our ACP hat and we go to the fucking Schiller Institute and I'm giving a wink at all my fellow LaRoucheites instead of just espousing an overt, explicit position we publicly committed to even before this convention.
Of our country, which we know as the United States of America, though some of you live in Canada. Laughter. In another event held a month later, where the Constitution of the
Wasn't a month later, it was the same day, whatever.
ACP was adopted, another curious reference to Canada is made.
There's nothing curious about it. If you actually followed up with the launch of the ACP, and if you did your due diligence to be just a little bit familiar with what we have said constantly publicly, there is nothing curious about this. Our position is absolutely clear.
The Constitution recognizes one communist party within the territory currently occupied by the United States and Canada.
And at another event last year, the podium which Haas gives his speech shows a map of what is presumably supposed to be this future ACP-governed America.
The event by the Institute for a Free America, which is not ACP, this is an ACP logo since when? The ACP didn't exist during this event. Again, if you're going to make a hit piece so meticulously researched, apparently you're pretending like that, it's these little details that you get wrong that just discredit everything.
Notice that it includes both the United States and Canada, and over on Twitter, Jackson Hinkle has made statements like, the war to liberate Canada will not be a war on the people of Canada, it will be a war to liberate Canada from the British globalists, and Manifest Destiny is not complete until the US liberates Canada, and why are we spending so much money on Ukraine when we can so easily complete Manifest Destiny and liberate Canada? I'm sure many of you are already familiar.
Okay, and I'm sure all the JD Pondon memes and all of that is like an official position by an organization when someone fucking... And like people will get confused because like, what do you mean it's a meme? Like you're saying there was nothing serious about it? No, there obviously is a real kernel of seriousness. But the idea that Jackson is officially trying to give expression to a literal call for war instead of expressing the sentiment that, as a matter of fact, Canada's part of the British Commonwealth, and instead of attacking Russia and attacking China, we should look more inwards, I guess. It's a rhetorical expression that is meant to serve the purpose of rejecting the vestiges of colonialism, fundamentally, and to rhetorically give more strength to the anti-imperialist position.
Familiar with the concept of Manifest Destiny, but for those who don't know, Manifest Destiny refers to the ideology of American expansion across the Americas, a process which included a genocide against the indigenous peoples, and in any case, it's a nationalistic American idea, so it's very strange that a founder of the American Communist Party is citing Manifest Destiny as a justification to invade Canada.
I just want us to be crystal clear about the record of history, okay? I don't care what your views on Manifest Destiny are. Make them whatever you want them to be. But don't say it's curious for a founding member of the American Communist Party to cite it approvingly, when it was the standard Marxist position, always, that it was historically progressive. Not just by Karl Marx himself, not just by Frederick Engels, not just by Lenin, not just by the CPUSA, from day one, but it was a standard communist position. You are free to critique that position. I'm not limiting your freedom to deviate from that standard position. I am limiting your freedom, Brandon, to somehow say it is bizarre or out of the ordinary for a Marxist or a communist to have that viewpoint or express that viewpoint. And moreover, to apply that rhetoric toward Canada, which is not an indigenous nation, is not strange at all. It's a skillful employment of American patriotic rhetoric to promote division within the imperialist camp. You fucking idiot.
Of spreading American civilization and completing Manifest Destiny and a war to liberate Canada.
No, you're mixing up a lot of different things, okay? Let's read what the thing about American civilization is. Let's just get into it, okay? So, look, this is what we say about American civilization. It has nothing to do with Jackson's tweets that he made a year before the party was launched about Manifest Destiny on Canada, okay? What it says is we want to discover and cultivate a national continental American culture on the basis of its unique history, geography, and ethnic makeup. We want to promote language, autonomy, and economic development for the American tribes. And we want to unify the nation across all racial antagonisms. We want one unified American identity. And we want to overcome racial division. So that's what that means. But you're conflating that with Jackson's tweets about Canada and Manifest Destiny.
Canada makes it sound like the ACP isn't necessarily talking about a peaceful, consensual unification of the US and Canada. It sounds like they're saying that Canada will be part of...
What has the ACP said about any kind of unification between the US and Canada? If only the party has articulated an official public position on the matter. If only it did. Here is what we actually have communicated on the question of Panama. So, statement on Trump and Panama, December 25th, 2024, when it was released. And here is what we released on our X account on the question of Canada. With respect to Trump's comments on Canada and Greenland, the party would like to take special attention to the complexity surrounding the issue. Canada, a member of the British Commonwealth, has long been a bulwark of Atlanticist reaction and has exerted a reactionary influence upon the development of the United States. Standard Marxist position for Frederick Engels, who regarded Canada as a reactionary bulwark. Standard position for American communists like William Z. Foster, who was the son of Fenians. If you don't know who Fenians were, they were Irish people who went up and fought the British in Canada and wanted to have Canada and the USA be one united republic, which was a standard American position actually for a long time before the mid-century of the 20th century. It has long been the aspiration of the American revolutionary tradition, as well as the view of Marx and Engels themselves, for Canada to be included in the United States. That is very true. However, it is necessary to consider carefully the conditions under which such an annexation would take place. Any violation of the sovereignty of any people anywhere is simultaneously a violation of the sovereignty of the American people themselves. The same apparatuses of imperial and neo-colonial control, which bypass democratic constitution and sovereign legitimation, will and have inevitably been applied to the American people themselves. We reject any pretext for the U.S. regime to expand its powers beyond those enumerated by the Constitution. If it deepens the rift between his administration and NATO, we remain open to the possibility that such developments might have progressive significance, because we support the aim of exiting from NATO. So that is a far cry from the claim this guy's making that we're calling as a party for some kind of forceful reunification. Now, if we have expressed rhetoric before the founding of the party, or even if non-party people who are affiliated or sympathetic to our party, I should rather say, have expressed that, what we have always imagined or foreseen is if a revolutionary situation breaks out in the USA, then Canada will be a launching pad for NATO and the British Commonwealth and the forces of the international capitalist class to regain the USA, lost by a victorious proletarian revolution. And under those circumstances, an American revolution would become a revolutionary war of context, where yes, Canada would be forcefully annexed and conquered because it has lost any right of sovereignty because it engaged in aggression against the USA. But never do we just simply say that we want to just invade Canada and forcefully take it, unless it's like a meme. Nobody seriously, in any official kind of serious way, endorses that view.
The idea of annexing Canada is an old American imperial goal. The Continental Army attempted and failed to conquer Canada in the Revolutionary War, and the U.S.
Oh, so you're saying it didn't start with LaRouche?
And since then, there have been no serious attempts to annex Canada, and not that much talk about it.
1888. This is what Engels said in 1888 in a letter to Sorge. In 10 years, sleepy Canada will be ripe for annexation. The farmers will demand it themselves. The country's already half annexed socially. It will abolish this ridiculous boundary line. And when time comes, John Bull will say amen to this matter. The first Google result for a supposedly unserious notion. I guess Engels was I guess that was a thing. I guess LaRouche took a fucking time machine and made Engels have that sentiment. Or why don't you just put two and two together? If you're a Marxist committed to the American revolutionary tradition, and you are trying to deepen that tradition, you're probably going to have to come to terms with the fact that our northern neighbor is still a member of the British Commonwealth, which is symbolically, at the very least symbolically, a signification that the revolution was unfinished. And the notion that the American Revolution was unfinished has always been championed and promoted by progressive and revolutionary forces in this country, including MLK.
However, was recently revived by Donald Trump in his attempts to return to 19th century style American imperialism, and the ACP appears to agree. So now we have...
It's not our fault that Trump started saying this. We had to clarify our position in the midst of Trump's rhetoric because we said it first. We talked about Canada years and years ago. The party's position of one nation, Canada and the USA, predated, as far as we know, Trump's rhetoric on this matter. It wasn't until later in the year that we started hearing Trump say this. And I want to finally say there's nothing like chauvinistic about what we're saying, because Canada is not a victim of anything. okay? Just shut the fuck up for 1 second and stop treating fucking Canada as a third world country victim of predation. But even if it was, that's not even our position. So it's inapplicable, even if it was. For the very, very simple reason, and it's very simple, that we call for the reconstitution of the USA, which means one united republic encompassing Canada and the USA that reflects the popular sovereignty of the peoples of both of those countries. So it is not an extension of the USA onto Canada. It is actually a reconstitution of the USA in order to bring in Canada effectively, which means it's two people separated by what Engels called a ridiculous boundary coming together to renegotiate democratically the circumstances under which we would be a united country. That is not the same thing as annexing Canada as the USA, because we don't believe the USA will survive for very long. It's in our Constitution that we anticipate the USA will face certain reconstitution and dissolution. It's in our Declaration that we believe that.
Extreme misogyny, socializing with Nazis, flaunting wealth and mocking the poor, citing far-right philosophers, and calls for territorial conquest. These are...
So after what I said, point by point, every single accusation he makes there. This is why the narrative he's spinning has been so compelling for people, apparently. Because they missed the fact that every single thing he just said lacks any substantive basis. And I very meticulously, very thoroughly, not just dismantled it, but providing so many different kinds of devil's advocates, generously and charitably in his favor. From every which way, I completely dismantled the premises that serve as the basis for the claim he just accused us of, point by point. So again, if you miss it.
18th century style American imperialism mocking the poor. ACP appears to agree. So now we have extreme misogyny.
Okay, extreme misogyny. Debunked. Socializing with Nazis. Debunked.
Flaunting
wealth and mocking the poor. Debunked. Far-right philosophers. Debunked. Calls for territorial conquest. Debunked. None of these 5 things characterize anything to do with our party. None of these 5 things he just accused us of have anything to do with our party.
These are all accepted within the American Communist Party. This is all very strange, and it gets even stranger. I want to now turn to the speech by Haas. This speech is titled The Occupied States of America, and offers a direct explanation of the MAGA communist worldview. The ACP proclaimed itself to not only be Marxist, but the one and true authentic...
Direct explanation for the MAGA communist worldview. To do that, let's look at Haas's speech for the Institute of Free America. Let's not read his actual 12,000-word Substack called The Rise of MAGA Communism. Let's not do that. Let's watch his speech delivered the occupied states of America. Let's watch that to get to the real meat and potatoes of the theory and philosophy underlying this worldview.
Marxist-Leninist Party in America. You would think that this speech elucidates the principles of Marxism-Leninism. Let's take a look.
Okay, hold on. Wait a second. I gave a speech called The Occupied States of America to talk about how America has lost its sovereignty, to talk about how we don't have any popular sovereignty, and how the U.S. has been usurped by an oligarchical elite for almost 100 years that is actually occupying our country. If I gave a speech about Palestine and I talked about the details of the Zionist occupation of Palestine, is it curious that I'm not devoting the entirety of my speech to introducing people to Marxism-Leninism? You will find in my speech a consistent reflection of Marxist-Leninist principles, but that is not the subject matter of my speech. So if the subject matter of my speech is not directly about introducing people to Marxist-Leninist theory, is that somehow curious? Is that somehow strange?
And eventually, in the aftermath of the Civil War, almost every aspect of economic life became dependent actually on banking cartels. The law of monopoly, the aggregation of various industries and forms of property, gave rise...
Summarize what I just said. You can be a Marxist-Leninist and talk about specific subject matters, and that's not curious. That's not strange. That's not bizarre. You're talking about something very concrete and specific. Not every fucking speech you give is an introductory course on Marxism-Leninism. If my speech was about Palestine, which in part it was, but if it was entirely devoted to the topic of Palestine, it doesn't make me less of a Marxist-Leninist to talk about something very specifically happening now or in history.
See, a group of the wealthiest private bankers, led by J.P. Morgan, all decided that they were going to seize control of the reins of the economy. They were seizing control of the manufacturing, the transportation, the mining, the telecommunications.
Okay, but that is an actual matter of historical fact. If you want to challenge the veracity of what I'm saying on a historical level, feel free to do. But let's see what Brandon does in response to what I say.
The financial markets. I should also add some added context here. This cartel of bankers, this cartel of monopolists, these weren't just wealthy Americans. These were people who had extensive relationships, blood ties, and even marriages with the British oligarchy,
Which is true. Okay, Carol Quigley wrote a book called The Anglo-American Establishment. It's on archive.org. It's right here. Carol Quigley, The Anglo-American Establishment. It's right here. And they go into detail about this. It's not a conspiracy theory. Now, you could say, oh, is it bizarre for a Marxist-Leninist to talk about facts? What did Lenin say about facts? What did Mao say about facts? Is it bizarre to just talk about facts instead of just abstract doctrine and talk about specific facts about the world? Is that bizarre? Is that strange for a Marxist-Leninist? Or is that fucking standard? You fucking idiot!
powers of old Europe. But according to him, it was a goal of this elite. He even formed a secret society toward that aim of recovering the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire. Now, they haven't done that formally speaking, but in terms of the complete co-option of our institutions, in everything but name, it seems like it was pretty successful.
Now, if you understand anything about the ideas of Marxism, it's plainly clear that this is not Marxism.
If I say water is H2O, is that Marxism? Scratch that. Please scratch that. Scratch that. Is this Marxism? Is this Marxism? Is a concrete analysis Marxism? Or is Marxism just the reproduction of an abstract doctrine, of an abstract mathematical formula that is not actually concretely applied in the analysis of reality? What is Marxism? Is Marxism concrete? For Marxism to have meaning, does it need to be concretely applied? Or does it suffice to reproduce what BreadTube told you, some abstract thing about the relationships of production where the capitalists own it and the wage earners? Yeah, sure, but concretely apply that in the investigation of reality to see what that actually means in reality. Does it just mean taking empirical phenomena and shoehorning them in your pre-given definitions and conceptual framework? Or does it mean concretely tracing the development of the capitalist class, just as Lenin did in a little fascist book, a fascist Nazi book Lenin wrote called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism?
His call for the abolition of capitalism, which is based upon the exploitation of...
It's true abstractly, but what does it translate into concretely? It's almost there's an entire history of this.
The working class by the capitalist class. But Haas doesn't really talk about class struggle. He talks about a quote-unquote British financial cabal.
We're gonna roll that back, just so the editors have an easier time. Let's roll it back.
But Haas doesn't really talk about class struggle. He talks about a quote-unquote British financial cabal.
Haas doesn't talk about class struggle. He just talks about the concrete form of a class that rules the country at the expense of other classes, like the working class. He's not talking about class struggle. He's just talking about a capitalist financial elite. That's totally not related to class struggle, okay? The capitalist class is irrelevant to class struggle. Class struggle is about slogans that reproduce abstract slogans. That's class struggle. Not talking about the actual historically constituted capitalist class, the actual one, no, which Carol Quigley called the Anglo-American establishment, which was overwhelmingly... All right, I'm going to get into MS Paint. I'm just going to give this more of a chance.
America, he doesn't talk in terms of the capitalist class ruling over the working class. In fact, he seems to dismiss...
No, but that's exactly what I talked about in that speech. Even though I didn't have to, because it's not always the subject matter of every topic. That is a matter of fact exactly what I talked to. I just talked about it concretely and in concrete terms. I talked about the specific development of monopoly capital in the USA. A very specific and concrete analysis, sure, but it's a concrete understanding of class struggle and its evolution, not an abstract one. It's a very simple distinction I'm making, central to anyone who's familiar with the rudiments of Marxism.
Class struggle in an offhand manner, declaring that this cabal oppresses Americans across class, and he seems to suggest that class struggle is actually a distraction.
40% of your personal income
tax ruling over the working class. In fact, he seems to dismiss class struggle in an offhand manner, declaring that this cabal oppresses Americans across class, and he seems to...
I wish someone in real life would look me in the eyes and say this. It will never happen. No one will ever have the audacity to embarrass themselves with the shame of saying such stupid, mindless things in front of me. They will get scared, not of me physically, that I'm going to do something. They will get scared to utter such a stupid thing to an actual person. How do you have such a lack of shame to say such a stupid thing? That I reject class struggle because I am trying to explain and specify the concrete development of the capitalist ruling class, which does indeed suppress all other classes below it. That doesn't make class struggle irrelevant, because only the proletarian class can defeat that class, which I make pretty clear consistently all the time. We even launched a party, can you believe it? Which officiates that view that only the working class, united, can challenge the ruling imperialist monopoly capitalist class, the standard position of the CPUSA for nearly 100 years. Wow, this fucking lack of education is very sad. Forgive me for being angry and frustrated. I'm so irrational. That's really the problem. I'm just irrational. Hitlerite ideology is on the rise. There is an immense gap in education as far as the layman and the history and the theory of Marxism. And this guy is reinforcing that ignorance and stupidity and spreading it on a mass scale and aiding and collaborating with fascism. And I'm here in my fucking studio yelling. In vain, that's the truth. In vain. How can we close the gap? How do we educate people about Marxism-Leninism? How do we do that if they're shouting and screaming at us? On the one hand, the right is screaming that we're Jews, and on the other hand, these people are screaming at us that we're Lyndon LaRouche Nazis.
To suggest that class struggle is actually a distraction.
40% of your personal income taxes, I didn't know this until a few years ago, it actually shocked me. It doesn't go to welfare queens. It doesn't even go to corporations not paying their fair share, whatever Bernie Sanders says. 40% of your personal income tax goes to paying interest on the national debt. They have us fighting each other about, oh, if you're a little more rich, you should be paying more. Oh, it's these welfare queens responsible for our high taxes. How is nobody talking about the fact that nearly half of every dollar that we pay?
Okay, so the premise, the claim he makes, is that I say that class differences don't matter because of what I just said here. According to Marxism, class is not defined by relative differences in wealth. That is not how class is defined. That is Bernie Sanders's or Democrats or liberals' definition of class. Even among the working class, there are relative differences in income and wealth. Just because someone is wealthy and rich doesn't make them qualitatively part of a different class. Class is not defined by wealth. Class is defined by your relationship to the means of production. The problem is, in our society of extreme concentration of capital and monopoly capital in particular, even people who are entrepreneurs don't really own their means of production. Financial capital owns almost everything in actual practice. And people who are rich and make more money just tend to be the people that are higher on the corporate ladder or the ladder of salaries and professions, or they're even given benefits of all kinds. But the actual ownership of the means of production, as I outline in this video, is concentrated in very small hands. So class struggle is not about relative differences in wealth among people who are outside of the financial elite. So to say that what I just said means I'm saying class differences don't matter is absurd, because the definition of class within Marxism isn't wealth.
It is going to literally nothing, right? It's going to the humiliation of us as a country and as a people.
And Haas repeats this theme over and over. In a Twitter thread from 2023, Haas says that MAGA communists oppose private property, which you would expect for communists. Communists have always opposed private property, though that term can be confusing and misleading. Historically, private property referred specifically to a social relationship where a private owner takes possession of property, which is...
Why don't we read what Marx said about private property? Because the early Marx writes a lot about what private property actually is, and the alienation that is a prerequisite for the institution of private property. This is an extremely nebulous and vague definition right here.
Is worked on by others. It doesn't refer to your toothbrush or television, which are personal property, but rather productive assets like machinery and tools, or land from which rent can be extracted. Essentially, it refers to the private ownership of capital and land, something which communists want to abolish in favor of public ownership.
I'm just curious, because I've read the Communist Manifesto, and none of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto directly say we're just going to abolish private property right away. Because the idea of the dissolution of private property as an institution is regarded as a long-term consequence of the proletarian dictatorship, not a policy, not a voluntary thing that's done to just abolish it. Private property is regarded as a factor of civil society whose conditions and premises are being undermined by the development of capitalism itself. And that's why socialism and its victory is being anticipated as an inevitability of history.
Abolish private property, but his definition of private property is a little different. As he says,
why is it different? Let's see, why is it different? Because I actually give a definition that gets to the core essence of what private property is, the essence of private property. An essence which reaches its fullest culmination and development if we are living in late capitalism, which is on the cusp of the dissolution of that mode of production.
Everyone dreams of getting rich, but it is because you want to use that wealth for a specific reason.
Yeah, I'm speaking in relatable language here, by the way, which is very effective and which is very useful. It does a lot to actually dispel the fears and the fear-mongering surrounding what communists mean by abolishing private property. Because as you can recall, if you're actually familiar with Marx's works, Marx talks about this in Private Property and Communism in 1844, where he's dissuading this idea that communism is just aggregating everything into one thing owned by everyone. And he's saying, no, this is missing the point. So the relationship between personal ownership and personal dreams even that have any kind of human significance at all, really, have to be carefully distinguished from the essence of what private property is as an institution. Because for Marx, private property is a fundamentally antisocial, anti-human institution of alienation. At its essence, that's what it is. At its essence. All relationships of production are contaminated by the institution of private property under capitalism. But what the essence of private property itself is not exactly clear to people. And the notion that private property refers to the thin line and distinction between your life activity as an individual and other people is really misleading. Because the problem in America is that most people associate private property with what? Signs on people's lawns that say private property. So that's the thin line that gives you privacy. Private property is associated with individual privacy, or the privacy of goals and aspirations and so on of individuals. So abolishing private property just means, for most people, it's a free-for-all where everyone has immediate access to everything. And Marx, in Private Property and Communism, calls this crude communism, and he rejects that notion. And I actually get to the essence of what private property is.
On a yacht or a luxurious mansion, a nice car, etc. But private property in the form of capital is not any substantive real wealth, but money for...
That is absolutely true. If you read Marx's Capital, that's literally what it is. M prime literally just leads to prime. That's the essence of capital in its developed form, prime.
Own stake. As we can see today with fiat currency and the outrageous speculations of the financial class, money has ceased to represent any real wealth at all, but takes the form of power the banksters are using to implement their Great Reset agenda to enslave entire nations.
What is not true about that? You see how they always say that, oh, the rhetoric sounds like XYZ, instead of actually addressing the content of what I say, whether it's true or not. Because this is actually true. When a private cartel of banks, the Treasury, has the power to set interest rates and effectively use money as a political tool, this represents how capital has been so far divorced from its actual earthly premises, which is a process Marx actually describes and anticipates in the writing of Capital Volume 3, if you read it.
Communists do not oppose wealth. They oppose the institution of a private property, which subjugates the entire economy to an institution which is completely antisocial, anti-human, anti-civil, and in fact anti-wealth.
This is like literally the most concise summary of what Marx says about private property. That private property, even who writes about this, is Marx directly. When he writes about the irony of the miser, and let me try to find it actually. This is not even where it is, but this boundless greed after riches, this passionate chase is common to the capitalist and the miser. While the miser is merely a capitalist gone mad, the capitalist is a rational miser. But Marx actually gets into a very intelligent argument.
Private property is not your personal possessions. It is not your car and it is not your home. It is not even your small business. Private property.
That's true. And again, there's nothing that sounds crazy to someone who just learned about Marxism yesterday. But when you actually think about it and apply Marxism consistently, you will find that entrepreneurship is not essentially and inherently a private property. It is an activity very much defined under capitalism by the institution of private property, but that's not the essence of what it is. In essence.
Property is the debt you pay to banks with interest for taking out a mortgage to be...
Yeah, literally. The institution of private property in the form of capital, according to Karl Marx himself, culminates in prime. That's what private property, in its essence, is revealed to be at its most bare and essential level. So here it is. Self-renunciation, thus political economy, is true moral science. Self-renunciation, the renunciation of life, all human needs. The less you eat, the less you go to theater, the less you drink, the more you save, the greater becomes your treasure, which neither moths nor rust will devour, your capital. The less you are, the less you express your life, the more you have. The greater is your alienated life. Literally, that's exactly. Isn't it intelligent how I express this really old, seemingly impenetrable arguments by Marx in ways that are relatable to people in the 21st century, like talking about yachts and cars and about how at least that still has the human quality of your dreams somehow. It's not even an endorsement of yachts. It's like at least that is something still human. But capital and private property at its essence is not what it is at its essence. At its essence, it is usury. It is money for money's own sake, which is absolutely true.
Be able to afford a home. Private property is the institution which mercilessly destroys families and societies, having no regard for any genuine human needs, and devoid of any human character. Private property is the institution
Hey guys, we are not going to have the same rate throughout this video, throughout the whole thing. So we're gonna just focus on arguments he makes instead of watching the entire thing. Because if we watch the entire thing, it's gonna be 5 hours long. I don't know if you guys even want that.
It is on its basis that all civilization begins to break down, and even the most sacred relations of familial and communal bonds are destroyed as women enter into prostitution and men fall victim to suicide and drug abuse.
Yeah, that's rhetoric directly transplanted from the Communist Manifesto, replicated throughout the entire history of communist literature, which describes the decay of capitalism and the rise of bourgeois degeneracy. But he's going to say it's fascist rhetoric, right? Yeah.
So how do communists want to abolish?
Oh, good. Teach the young people, teach the generation that Marxism is just fascism. That way they'll become Nick Fuentes fans and they'll start Hail Hitler and doing the Sieg Hails. And you're encouraging them to do that. Congratulations.
Property. Communists do not advocate taking people's possessions. And in fact, we do not even advocate taking people's businesses.
Right, we don't. Because China doesn't. And China is ruled by the largest communist party on earth. Fancy that. Fancy that. People's small businesses, we don't call for unilaterally expropriating them. You want to know who else didn't? The Communist Manifesto didn't. The 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. Nowhere do they include simply taking over people's shit, their entrepreneur, their businesses, wholesale. And why can I say that so confidently in 2025? Why can I say that so confidently for us? Because the only businesses that still exist that have a semblance of personality or that are not already socialized by a really abstract form of capital, those are not the fundamental means of production that a communist state would be nationalizing right away. Small-scale businesses like a diner or a restaurant, that would not be taken by a communist state because they are not big enough at scale to be of any relevance to the property question for communists at a fundamental level of facilitating the development of society in the direction of the development of socialism, which is something that is happening materially at the level of civil society.
So according to Haas, private property doesn't refer to private ownership of the means of production. It doesn't refer to capitalist business.
No, it does refer to that. It does. But what does private mean? Private does not mean individual. Private ownership of the means of production means the dominance of capital over the means of production, and means of production in the form of capital. That is what gives it the quality of being private property, not the exclusive management by a certain individual or the exclusive ownership even by a given individual.
Businesses. Rather, by private property, Haas means usury, which is destroying.
Yes, because the whole point is that capital is radically super individual. It is the notion that private property is exclusive individual ownership is a myth of the bourgeoisie. Marx himself, in the writing of Capital, very clearly reveals that private property in its developed form is radically impersonal. It takes the form of capital, which is a principle that is it's almost like an autonomous principle of accumulation. It's a radically alienated logic of the reproduction of society itself. And that is the irony of Marxist Capital. It is good for communists to remove the human face from private property. It's good to remove the human face. Your neighbor doesn't have private property. The people you know don't have private property. Private property is an institution that has taken the form of cartels and, yes, a real elite, not necessarily defined by people in hoods at a table, but an exclusive elite that has the reins of control and power over the fundamental institutions of capital.
Sacred relations of familial and communal bonds. Owning a business and getting rich, that's not a problem. The problem is the cabal of bankers.
I paraphrased language that was directly from the Communist Manifesto, but let's see him spin it as fascist.
who are bleeding the productive economy dry. That's the real enemy. In this thread, Haas uses the terms a capitalist class and a working class, but he's not using these terms in a Marxist sense. The
Why not?
capitalist class is not the actual capitalist class, but the international financial cabal.
Do you see the twisted idealism at play here? Do you see the twisted logic at play here? Do I have to yell for you guys to understand how it is? The actual capitalist class is this abstract definition, whereas Huz is talking about something concrete. He makes it appear as if the actual capitalist class is some abstract theoretical definition rather than a concrete social formation. If there is an actual capitalist class that exists, Brandon, if one actually exists, like in actuality, it takes a concrete social form. So what is that? Who is that capitalist class? It is a global, transnational class. That should probably be abundantly clear because the financial institutions that represent the highest forms of capital accumulation are indeed transnational. And yes, it's a cartel, it's a cabal, it's a form of monopoly capital. These two things are correct empirically as far as the description of the actual capitalist class. The problem with you is that you're trying to personalize capitalist class relationships so they are familiar to people on an individual level of scale, so that you can categorize your neighbors and your coworkers, and you can apply the logic of Marxist class distinction at an individual level of scale, which just profoundly underestimates the extent to which capital has become, or at least the means of production have become radically socialized at a scale that is not really comprehensible or relatable, I should rather say, at the individual level. It's the dimension of relatability that obstructs people's ability to comprehend Marxist theory. They're trying to make it too relatable, such that they can say, I can see myself as a capitalist. You can't. Capital has become such a radically impersonal institution of scale. You cannot relate to it at an individual level today.
The working class is the American people who have to unite across class to defeat the international financial. This most definitely isn't a Marxism, but it does sound like another ideology. The struggle against international finance capital.
It's not Marxism, right? The Popular Front isn't Marxism. The Popular Front against monopoly capital isn't Marxism. Okay, if you want to say that the Comintern, that Dimitrov, that the CPUSA since the 1930s was not Marxist, make that argument. But to make the leap and equivocate their standard position, which is reflected on the flag of China today, that's fascist class collaboration, is unjustified. If you reject the view that's Marxism, go ahead and say that. You're a Trotskyite. Equating that with fascism is dangerous and irresponsible because you're effectively saying all of the history of communism was just fascist. Let's begin by trying to comprehend the Marxist-Leninist understanding of class distinctions. As we know, within Marxism, there is this kind of vague idea of the base and the superstructure, right? Here is the superstructure and here is the base, right? So typically people, position these correctly. And then classical Marxism comprehends that these are interrelated, yada, dialectically, right? Even though the base has a primary significance, the superstructure also helps in determining the form of the base, right? So this is the very simplistic understanding that comes from classical Marxism. Now, I will explain that in Leninism, a new contribution to Marxism is made that doesn't contradict classical Marxism, but rather elaborates upon it in ways that made classical Marxist dogmatists and the social democrat orthodox Marxists very uncomfortable. Lenin actually started to comprehend that there is an antagonism between the superstructure and base as well. That at the level of this contradiction right here, there was actually a contradiction, such that it's not just this. It's almost like at the level of the base, there are other inceptual possibilities of other superstructures, right? Constantly being endangered, in terms of their potentiality, right? And that the superstructure, instead of just being a superstructure, if it's an apparatus of class control, has to evolve into being this hegemony, which is a notion that was elaborated by Antonio Gramsci, right? And a hegemony, it's like above, in a way, the superstructure itself. And a hegemony suppresses all of these inceptual, alternative possible superstructures. So this is why Lenin he's the theorist of imperialism, because within classical Marxism, an imperial principle is not really recognized in general. Only the bourgeois republican principle. That's the typical superstructure that just directly reflects the capitalist base, right? And so in classical Marxism, you just have a kind of one dimension of contradiction, which is right here, right? But Lenin, he introduces something on top of this scheme, which is hegemony. Now, if there's hegemony, there is also correspondingly a kind of, let's just call it democratic populism. It's a kind of Sophianic principle that was a vestige of the influence of the Narodnik movement in Russia, which Lenin and all the revolutionaries at the time took for granted in many ways. But for them, the kind of the dimension of the people's popular revolution was something that also was a principle that superseded this classical Marxist distinction, but from the opposite direction. So this is the base of guerrilla warfare that fights the imperial hegemony. So this is, and basically this is where it is, and this is where Mao and the Popular Front in China was, and this is like Japan. And so this, in this schema, as applied to the Popular Front, Dimitrov and the theorists of the Popular Front in the 1930s basically said that to apply Leninist principles correctly, fascism was associated with this extra-republican, extra-constitutional, open dictatorship, right? That is threatening even the constitutional integrity of a bourgeois democratic republics, right? And that the only way to resist it is to go down, lower into the masses, and have this kind of democratic popular front that does indeed cut across class distinctions that exist within the base, to have a principle that can fight the hegemony, imperial hegemony, okay? Now, this is so crazy and schizophrenic, so we're just going to go back to the simple Marxist, classical Marxist thing of the superstructure and the base, so that no one loses their mind and gets a headache. But okay, let's understand clearly that in the base, you have a class contradiction, right? Let's just say the proletariat is a circle and the bourgeoisie is a square, right? I don't know if this seems like it reflects conflict, but there's like this contradiction in the base itself, right? And it was Lenin who pointed out that there are also, by the same logic, there's also a contradiction at the level of superstructure. And that is why above the bourgeois Republican superstructure, you have this imperial tendency, right? He describes that in the development of capitalism itself, culminating in imperialism. But imperialism was not just about the development of an economic system. It also referred to a tendency that was observed by Lenin during World War I, which is why he called World War I a reactionary war, where bourgeois democracy was being suspended with emergency powers, and there's this new imperial political tendency, which had already existed in Russia at the time. Because you understand, let me explain something. In Russia, the schema was, this was the Duma, right? This was the autocracy, right? And then here you had class distinction, and then below you had here the Russian peasantry. So I want you to understand this schema to simplify Marxism-Leninism, because you can actually be an Anglo-box guy and fit this in, and you can put many different kind of things here. For example, instead of autocracy, you can have Japanese imperialism or Zionism or whatever, right? Here you can have some kind of sovereignty, traditional bourgeois sense of sovereignty. You have your typical class distinctions, and then you can have the Chinese Popular Front, anti-fascist Popular Front, yada, 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 right? This schema is, instead of just the base superstructure one that comes from classical Marxism, you have this one in Marxism-Leninism, okay? Now, again, both of these are things that transcend the superstructure, the autocracy and the Russian peasantry, from opposite directions. The autocracy consolidates the superstructure. Imperial principle consolidates superstructure, locks it in. It consolidates the superstructure and it locks it in, okay? The superstructure this is open terrain, democratic site of battle, okay? Now here, let's just call this popular principle. Popular principle, permanent state of chaos, that highly volatile. So this is not sufficiently clear, I understand that. But as you can see, both of these, in a way, transcend this distinction and give expression to its form. So this is a battle at the level of form, right? And this is the content. This base here, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, it's a fundamental class distinction. But the victory of the bourgeoisie leads to a specific kind of superstructure, which, in response to proletarian class antagonism, culminates in an imperial principle, right? This locks in the superstructure in favor of the bourgeoisie, right? So what Lenin does and what Mao does is the base is constantly being reproduced. Constant reproduction. The base is constantly being reproduced here. Down below, it's constantly being reproduced, right? And I will cite something from Lenin to help that's from left-wing communism and infantile disorder that will help actually understand this. So Lenin writes, for example, that the dictatorship of the proletariat means a war against the new class, against a more powerful enemy, the bourgeoisie, whose resistance is increased tenfold by their overthrow, whose power lies not only in the strength of international capital, the strength and durability of their international connections. So that, Lenin right there, you see where he's talking about, that is a reference to the system of hegemonic imperialism, which is right here. This is the imperial principle. That is what he's talking about there. He talks about how, in addition to that, also the force of habit, the strength of small-scale production, and that he says small-scale production engenders capitalism and the bourgeoisie continually, daily, hourly, spontaneously, and on a mass scale. And that this is what makes the dictatorship of the proletariat necessary, and that victory is not possible over the bourgeoisie without a long, stubborn, desperate struggle, which calls for tenacity, discipline, and single and inflexible will. So he's talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat and its necessity here. So let me go back to here, right? So what he just described, force of habit and small-scale production, and it's happening from below, and it's engendering newly and afresh, reproducing these relationships of production, hourly, daily, and so on. That is coming from the popular principle right here, the highly volatile dimension of material existence, of an organic material national or social body, right? And this is the dimension of civil society and culture. So there are two axes under which you can understand the traditional base of capitalist production, right? One is the imperial principle that consolidates and locks in the specific and unique establishment of a bourgeoisie. It's a specific cartel, it's a specific monopoly, whatever, right? But then also, the base is constantly being reproduced at the level of relations within civil society, okay? And that is the popular principle. That is the dimension of the people, where there is no clear class distinctions, where there is a vacillating mass that has proletarian tendencies. It has bourgeois tendencies. Just as Lenin was describing the peasantry in the development of capitalism in Russia, right? One of his earliest works. There is a ambiguity at this level. And why is that? Because institutionally, there is a kind of volatility and openness which constantly disturbs every imperial principle. Just like in Gaza, it's disturbing the Zionist occupation, and therefore disturbing the establishment of a very specific capitalist superstructure, right? Because from the people themselves, there's this resistance that's constantly being endangered. But it's not only resistance, as Lenin said, you could also say, in a way, this is where the reproduction of society at a material level is actually happening. Now, the thing is that in Marxism, real historical changes happen here. This is the interesting thing. Within Marxism, the real changes in history are happening here, okay? Whereas here, in Marxism, forces that retard history exist here. So look how interesting. This is just Marxism-Leninism for you. All of the active and vital transformations that are subtly happening, the way in which from the logic of capitalism itself. New relations of production, of socialism are emerging, whatever that Marx describes. This is only happening at the organic material level of civil society. Material relations of production that are a consequence of the force of habit. Just as Lenin said, the bourgeoisie is being reproduced hourly and daily and so on. That reproduction here accelerates transformation. It's movement, it's development. Reproduction is development. Something that reproduces, according to dialectics, also develops in a direction of change. But the imperial principle actually retards and halts and tries to freeze that reproduction, right? It tries to freeze that reproduction to lock it in, to maintain the hegemony of a single monopoly, a single establishment, and so on. A single hegemony, right? That's why the accelerationist position of unleashing capitalism and freeing it up from imperialist hegemony, like Deng Xiaoping in a way, the reason Marxists have this optimism that will lead to socialism is because of this idea that the imperial hegemony is retarding the development of history by locking in a specific institution of class dictatorship. That is, you can also think of things in terms of, let's just have a neutral shape, I don't know, an oval. In framing, right? In framing. Yeah, I'll just put it this way. So here you have class contradictions, right? Here you have class contradiction, right? That's happening right here, right? But sometimes the superstructure takes the form of, for example, imperialism, Zionism, autocracy, fascism, you name it, right here. So sometimes this becomes a secondary contradiction, right? Sometimes this becomes a secondary contradiction, right? This is the whole people, right? And this becomes, let me just, I don't know, use green, I don't know, or red to emphasize antagonism. This, let me see, this becomes the primary contradiction. So this is another way to simplify it if the other way was too complicated for you. So there's a base and the superstructure, but sometimes the base unifies is in a way because each base is national in form against a superstructure, an established and consolidated superstructure. So what is the example that Mao gives? Is Mao a fascist? In a semi-colonial country, the relationship between principle and contradiction and non-principle presents a complicated picture. When imperialism launches war of aggression against such a country, all its various classes, except for some traitors, can temporarily unite in a national war against imperialism. That it's Mao talking about supposed class collaboration, right? At such a time, the contradiction between imperialism and the country concerned becomes the principal contradiction. Well, all the contradictions among the various different classes are temporarily relegated to a secondary and subordinate position. Okay, so this is what Mao says, right? Now, look at this diagram I made for you for free, by the way, right here. So again, this becomes the primary contradiction, and these contradictions within the people become secondary contradictions under these circumstances, right? That Mao describes, for example. But the interesting thing is that the logic doesn't confine itself to the context of a semi-colonial country, because this same logic is applied to anti-imperialism and the anti-fascist Popular Front. It's the same logic, it gets applied in different ways. And this is the essential distinguishing factor of Marxism-Leninism versus classical Marxism, okay? So let me explain something also. Now let me explain the distinction between that and fascist class collaboration. So fascist class collaboration rejects class struggle. It attempts to unite classes in a corporatist sense, where different classes like the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, are given institutional principles, elevated to an institutionalized political principle, a corporate or whatever, right? But in the Marxist-Leninist conception of the Popular Front, only the proletariat is elevated to a principle, an institutional principle of class politics. Everyone else is given the benefit of the doubt of just being among the people. So their class status is not politically recognized, and therefore their class position and their class relationships are not officiated on an institutional level. So fascism attempts to officiate and institutionalize class relationships, right? Besides the proletariat, and sharing power between proletariat and bourgeoisie and so on. This is the kind of corporatist idea. But in the Marxist-Leninist notion of the Popular Front, none of these other classes are even recognized politically. They're just given the benefit of the doubt that, yes, you may come from the bourgeoisie, you may come from the petty bourgeoisie, but we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you are just the people. You are among the people. Only the proletariat's class status is recognized and officiated at a political level, right? Under its leadership, moreover, under its leadership. That's also very important. These other classes are given the benefit of, they're being given a way out, basically. Okay, you may be part of the bourgeoisie, you may be part of the petty bourgeoisie, but you're part of this popular front that represents civil society genuinely. And therefore, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, well, we could unite with you and collaborate with you on a democratic level, right? But not at the level of a corporatist class collaboration, where we're making your class status explicit at an institutional political level, right? So that is the difference from fascist class collaboration. It's a fundamental difference. Again, it takes a lot of intelligence to comprehend that. In Marxism, there is a dimension where class differences are not made primary. That's the democratic dimension. The whole people, everyone, right? It's a universalist principle of politics. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat, you still have a dimension of democratic existence. And why is that? Because Marxists recognize that even upon the seizure of power, what happens? What happens? Even when there's a seizure of power, what happens? What happens? Because of the force of habit within civil society, the strength of small-scale production and still is engendering class relationships daily, hourly, spontaneously, and on a mass scale. This is what makes a proletarian dictatorship necessary. Even when you overthrow the imperialist state machine, it's still necessary to have a proletarian dictatorship. Why? Because at the level of civil society, you cannot eliminate class relationships and all the vestiges of capitalist civilization overnight. It's still going to exist. For example, China is a great example of that. That's not class collaboration, though. Just because you're acknowledging that you have not abolished all classes overnight and that it is necessary to have a popular front and to unite against the formative imperial principle of the superstructure, the imperialist hegemony, across class distinctions on a democratic basis, that does not mean it's class collaboration in the fascist sense. Because those are distinctions proper to the constitution of civil society at a material level, not the imperialist hegemony, not purely as a consequence of political will, not because of a certain ideology or a certain politics. That's just the nature of your nation. That's just the nature of how your people exist right now. Cannot be changed overnight. It didn't mean that Marxists abandoned the notion of popular sovereignty and national sovereignty entirely. It just means that they understand that class distinctions, first of all, take the form of a primary contradiction between an imperial hegemony, which is locking in a specific superstructure and a specific order of things in place. And that is the concrete form of the development of the class struggle. So even members of the petty bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie that have been locked out of that establishment, the imperial hegemony, they can be allies of the proletariat. In Palestine, members of the Palestinian bourgeoisie can be allies of the Palestinian proletariat, and they can unite together against Zionism. But what complicates that, and I was going to get into this lecture today as well, I don't know if we have time, what complicates that is the fact that capital has always been a global and profoundly geopolitical system. Capitalist relationships of production are not abstract. They are not an abstract system that has national forms applied everywhere. It's a very specific world system that has its roots in colonialism. And the interesting thing, I just want to do this quickly, all right? Give me a chance. I'm going to just do this quickly. And then we're going to kind of speed run the rest of the video. The interesting thing is that, let me just begin with a world, right? The interesting thing is that whenever you have a comprador bourgeoisie, right? Let's just say like the proletariat is red, bourgeoisie is blue, right? Let's just represent it that way. Oftentimes, the only way that this contradiction ever plays out, and the only way for the bourgeoisie to establish itself, is to become a comprador bourgeoisie, right? They become a comprador class that becomes part of the system of global imperialism. But here's the interesting thing. If you lag behind, if you are late to capitalism, let's say, right? If you lag behind and you are late to capitalism, this is the interesting thing. This class will never rise to the status of this. Never. They had a head start. This never happens. Why? Because they had a head start. So this is why I entertain the conspiracy theory of Anglo oligarchy and these old bloodlines and so on. Because when you think about it logically, if you had a head start and in the colonial plunder of the world, the first forms of capital accumulation, and you've consolidated that and institutionalized it, you will always be on top, no matter what. And to whatever extent capitalism develops in other countries, the most the capitalist class of those countries can develop within the system of global imperialism is a comprador class. And this comprador class will never, ever be able to replace the existing capitalist ruling class. Some of them may rise to the ranks and be recruited. That's entirely possible. But they will never, ever replace this. So the capitalist system is never, ever primarily national in form. It's always a global system of imperialism. Always. It is always global and profoundly geopolitical. Every attempt by an inceptual bourgeoisie to overthrow the Anglo Empire failed. In France, it failed. The bourgeois revolution in France did not topple the hegemony of the British Empire. The Germans, their elites were heavily intermixed and intermarried with the British, but they also failed. At least a few times they failed. World War II, I won't even say that was an attempt to topple them, because it wasn't, if you know the real history. But they failed, right? So the reason you can't it's stupid to claim that our views on the British Empire are, when you consider that the British Empire was the global capitalist hegemon only until America took its place. Now, this has a lot of significance because how did it take its place? Study the details and history of how this happened. You'll find a lot of continuity, literally, between the respective ruling classes, in blood and in... So this is all we're saying. You don't need to be able to point out this obvious fact. And it is especially important if we're operating in the American national context and we're trying to comprehend the evolution of capitalism and imperialism, to point out, to give communists both a rhetorical edge and an edge, and just a position of legitimacy in leading our nation to socialism. The fact that in order to do this, it is absolutely true that in the process of this, a lot of aspects of America's revolutionary identity were lost. That's not or crazy to point out. It's just true. If you understood in the late 19th century or mid-19th century even, how profoundly unique the American identity was in the painstaking lengths it went to contrast itself with the British Empire. If you understood how controversial the U.S.'s acquisition of Cuba from the Spanish-American War and the Philippines, how controversial it was. There was some real, American national identity that did pride itself on rejecting colonialism and associating that with the British past, and they saw it as a complete repudiation of the very foundations of what America was. I don't care if you criticize America's founding fathers, do that. But it is a matter of historical fact that there was a meaningful distinction between the United States of America as a revolutionary identity of nation building versus the British Empire. It was very important to American thinkers and for American public life until, suspiciously, the rise of the American monopoly capitalist class led to a lot of mergers in marriage and in the in institutions of capital, which created this Anglo-American establishment as described by Carroll Quigley. That actually did happen. Now, you don't have to say there's this big conspiracy of the British Empire or whatever to acknowledge the nuances of this. And there's no need to even invoke LaRouche's name to accept the facts of history and have a sober and clear analysis of how this transition right here happened, and its lasting significance and effects. Yes, it's absolutely true. The British supported the Confederacy, so there is a meaningful dichotomy between the founding of America as the first democratic republic in the world and the British Empire. I know it's crazy to say that, but trust me when I say that the American War of Independence was fought against the British Empire. So there's a significance there. I don't know. There's no outlandish LaRoucheite conspiracism that's necessary whatsoever to consult or even care. You don't even have to think about that. It's not relevant at all.
Isn't a Marxism, but it does sound like another ideology. The struggle against international finance capital.
Okay, so I very clearly explained how the standard Marxist-Leninist view has nothing to do with fascism, but I also want to point out something I find ironic, that, and we're going to be able to skip a lot of this, something Brandon does which is really interesting. He takes the rhetoric of fascists, attempting to hijack the rhetoric of socialist and communist movements dishonestly, and say because of the rhetorical similarity between this fascist movement that was rhetorically trying to hijack socialist rhetoric, because that sounds vaguely similar to what Haas, an actual communist, is saying, Haas is a fascist. But let's ask the question, does Brandon investigate what the Nazis did? Because the Nazis in no way fought against institutions of finance capital. They expanded their powers to an extraordinary and unprecedented degree in actual practice, which means this rhetoric was not sincere. But Brandon is attempting to depict their rhetoric as sincere. That's the problem. It's not sincere rhetoric. If it was sincere, they would not have been fascist to begin with. So to say this rhetoric is essentially fascist assumes that when fascists employed their rhetoric like this, they were being sincere. But the facts of history show us that they weren't, because they did nothing. They did nothing at all to curb the speculators and the financial capitalists at all. They did nothing to clamp down on the financial exchange circles, nothing at all. So they were not sincere when they were employing this kind of rhetoric. Now, you can claim we're not sincere either, but that would defeat the purpose, because you're claiming that we are unduly attacking the financial elite, and that's not the real enemy. And Hitler was attacking them as well. But Hitler wasn't actually attacking them. He was employing insincere rhetoric that sounded like he was opposed to them, but he wasn't in actual practice.
Regardless of whether this international financial cabal is defined in ethnic terms, it's still fascistic ideology and rhetoric. America,
Fascist rhetoric, according to Brandon,
is occupied by a parasitic financial elite, which Americans need to overthrow to restore traditional values, rejuvenate the country.
I didn't really say that, though. I didn't really say that. You're just like skewing my words in a very specific way to make them rhetorically sound like far-right stuff. You're not quoting me ad verbatim, are you?
And engage in territorial conquest. That's a
territorial... Oh, I forgot he lied about our stance on Canada. He pulled together a bunch of disparate, unrelated things, and he took a speech I gave about the concrete development of the capitalist class in the USA. Then he tied that to a Jackson tweet about liberating Canada, and he tied that to the Communist Manifesto talking about how capitalism liquidates any semblance of human civilization. And so he combines all of this together to spin this narrative that this is fascism, right? That I'm a fascist.
Marxism. It's not hyperbole to say that's not socialism, that's National Socialism. You'll notice too,
Standard Marxism-Leninism is National Socialism, because I can cite to you very easily writings of the Communist Party USA talking about the need to save civilization by uniting against monopoly capital. And I can point to you countless examples of Marxist-Leninists talking about the cultural decay that capitalism brings, and bourgeois decadence and capitalist decadence. And that the only way to stop this is to unite against monopoly capital and imperialist capital. I could point to you countless examples of Soviet propaganda, which does name the capitalist class. All right, foundations of Leninism. Under capitalism, the exploited masses don't participate in governing, even under the most democratic regime. Governments are not set up by the people, but by the Rothschilds, the Stinuses, the Rockefellers, and Morgans. Oh my God! Oh my God, it's fascism! That he actually names concrete examples of the capitalist class occupying governments. Wow, this is essentially fascist rhetoric. The fuck?
The presence of signifiers like the Great Reset, which is
The presence of signifiers that's a great word, signifier. What they reflect is widespread popular disillusionment of the direction the global elite are taking humanity.
this right-wing boogeyman of the last few years. In their interview on Chinese media, Jackson Hinkle and Grayson Walker.
It's a fucking term that was literally used by the world elite at Davos, by fucking Klaus Schwab, and literally the representatives of the global fucking capitalist class that they used. But now it's a right-wing term.
Talk about such things as the Great Reset and George Soros and the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab. And this is all rhetoric customary to...
Don't you dare talk about George Soros. You know, the guy that publicly brags about helping overthrow communist states in the late 1980s in Eastern Europe, who actually facilitated anti-communist color revolutions as a billionaire. Don't you dare rhetorically invoke his name, because sacred George Soros is a POC oppressed transgender who's untouchable, and you're a bigot if you fucking dare talk badly about him. You gotta wonder, like, why everyone's running toward the right wing. When you have self-proclaimed Marxists like Brandon Torres running cover for George Soros. Hey, Brandon, will you apply the same logic to people who talk bad about Elon Musk or even Donald Trump in their capacity as capitalists? A lot of people talk badly about Elon Musk. Why can you talk bad about Elon Musk but not George Soros? Can anyone answer me that question? And please don't mention these vague insinuations and perceptions that have no substance from the standpoint of Marxist theory about parallels in rhetoric. It means fucking nothing, because you have to judge us by the content of what we mean and what we say, not how similar it sounds. If Nazis employ rhetoric that says the sky is blue, that doesn't mean anyone who says the sky is blue is a fucking Nazi in essence.
To the far right, not the Marxist left, far and fascist ideology.
The far right. Hey, Brandon, what position of authority do you come from to label anything right or left? What left movement do you come from that actually fucking exists? Why are you making it seem like these are clearly defined things in America right now when they're not? Because there is no left movement at all. Everything's up in the fucking air, you idiot. Like, he's coming from this position of expertise. I know what the left is. I know what the far right is. I know what the left wing. Based on what? Like, what is left wing right now that actually exists in America? Please tell me, name one thing. How can you label anything far right if you don't even know what the left is? By what standard? What's the standard for the political spectrum we're using here? Okay, this is far right. Okay, based on, relative to what? Based on what? What does that mean in Marxist terms concretely? You have nothing.
Also presents itself as
There is no established left-wing movement in this country. Okay?
The powers that be. But instead of class struggle, it's conspiracy theories about international cabals trying to destroy the nation and traditional values.
Okay, instead of class struggle, you're talking about class distinctions in concrete terms as they actually exist, not as they only exist abstractly in theory, but how they actually do in reality. And this means you're a conspiracy theorist. Got it.
And that's exactly what characterizes the ACP's ideology. The ACP should not be treated as a communist party or a...
But it's like the cherry on top is that he can't fucking cite one thing our party has actually said. We've issued a lot of different statements and stuff, and our party has actually spoken as a party. And, like, he hasn't cited even one thing. Like, I've debunked every example he's tried to use, but, like, even if they were valid, like, where's the actual views of the ACP here?
Communist act. The communism appears to be intentionally deceptive branding to lure in young, naive leftists dissatisfied with the mainstream left and tell them that, hey, this is the new Communist Party of America. Join us. We hate capitalism, and by capitalism we mean international finance, quote unquote.
By capitalism, we mean the concrete capitalist system, not one that only exists abstractly.
So I want to explore this more deeply. Where exactly did MAGA communism come from? What's interesting...
And we're trying to, by the way, we're trying to deceive the very lucrative and growing and powerful, on the rise, radical left audiences who are so powerful and so widespread in their popularity that one could even say the whole zeitgeist of the current generation is the far left, young, naive far leftists. They're such a lucrative demographic for us to deceive and trick. They are so powerful and up and coming and on the rise. It's totally not the complete fucking opposite.
The thing about MAGA communism is that it's a distinct and novel far-right ideology. It isn't neo-Nazism, which is the most prevalent fascist ideology on the American far. This is something distinct, and I think by exploring the history.
But how are we far right again? I don't remember. Is it just because of the one thing Jackson said on Fresh and Fit taken out of context?
And origins of MAGA communism, we can
Like,
glean.
what else is there besides that you can use to call us far? Even then, it's a fucking nebulous, stupid thing to say. But even if we were to concede that's a far right thing Jackson said, what else?
Some valuable insights about the nature of reactionary ideology. A major clue as to the origins of MAGA communism is in Haas's speech I showed before. When Haas discusses this international financial cabal which is occupying America, he describes it as British for some reason. This
No, I didn't say it's British. I said the Anglo-American elite, which was referencing an author called Carol Quigley, and I cited a real quote by Cecil Rhodes, and then I talked about how they had extensive relationships and marriages with the British oligarchy. Mind you, the reason that's important to point out is because before World War II, the global capitalist hegemon that was the center of global capital was the British Empire, and that's a fact. So it makes sense that the ascendant one, which became America, there would be a degree of continuity there, and I pointed out that continuity.
This seems to make no sense. Is Haas saying that the US is controlled by Britain to this very day?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that the global capitalist class, first of all, is not comprised of people who fulfilled the American dream and made it up from scratch from nothing. I'm saying it actually is like an aristocracy in practice that has a long continuity with the previous ruling classes of the previous world hegemony. I talked about marriages and mixture and connections, which is much more nuanced than this straw man argument you're attributing to me that the British are this like nebulous lizard-like elite that just control us. I didn't say that. I talked about the continuity of actual ruling. I'm not saying comprador, who are lower on the pecking order. The ruling preeminent capitalist hegemonic capitalist cartels. There was mixture between the ascendant ones coming from the USA and the existing ones that were in Britain. That's a fact. Carol Quigley talks about it in his book, The Anglo-American Elite. And that has relevance for Americans who want to succeed the American revolutionary tradition.
America is literally oppressed and occupied by a British elite. What does this mean exactly?
No, it's a capitalist elite. That's the thing you missed from this whole speech, apparently. It's not important that they're British. It's important that they are a capitalist elite who have occupied this country in contradistinction to its own founding revolutionary ideals. It's a much more powerful message than the straw man you're trying to set up.
Fascist rhetoric is often esoteric and not meant to be taken literally, so it's easy to guess that Haas doesn't
What are you fucking talking about?
literally think that a British elite rules America. But why?
No, I don't think a British elite rules America because I plainly never even implied or said that at all. What I said is much more nuanced and complicated than that, you fucking idiot with zero IQ reading comprehension.
Does Haas use the word British to describe this international financial cabal?
I actually said Anglo-American. I said Atlanticist. You read the Wikipedia article on LaRouche. I'll tell you why he's constantly doing this straw man, because he read the Wikipedia article on LaRouche where they're like, oh, LaRouche talks about the British, but he really just means the Jews. And he's trying to attribute that to me somehow. He's making the grand leap as if I talk about the British in that way. Like, the British are doing this or that. I don't. I talk about the Atlantis elite. I talk about the Anglo-American elite. I did that in this speech, and I said a huge portion of today's ruling class is made up of that, sure, the City of London and Wall Street. But at no point do I talk about this nebulous conspiratorial cabal called, quote-unquote, the British. That's the Wikipedia article of LaRouche you're pinning on me, you fucking dishonest worm.
I think this is a clue to figuring out the origins of MAGA communism, and
Yeah, this guy's a detective, guys. It's like a clue, because he already came up with the conclusion, and he's asserting it into the premise, while pretending like he's this disinterested detective uncovering something. You didn't uncover anything. You asserted something about us ceaselessly from Johnny Socialism and them. That's where you got it from. That's the truth. And now you're pretending like you're a detective uncovering the truth from investigation. But there's no investigation. There's a process in which you're cherry-picking evidence and shoehorning it into this false procedure of reasoning and argumentation to lend credibility to this extremely baseless conclusion you already drew as and inserted as the premise.
It takes us back to an obscure figure in American history. That figure is Lyndon LaRouche.
I think even for those that may disagree with LaRouche's philosophy, right, they must at least concede that he is probably one of the most, if not the most, profound theorist and thinker of policy in the modern age. What do you think about that?
When I was in middle school...
All right, so everything he just showed from Jackson, from me, reflected something very specific, okay? We, at that time, through Caleb, our best friend, right? Greatest guy ever. Caleb very generously introduced us to the Schiller Institute. And the Schiller Institute, we came to know them in the following ways, right? Daniel Burke, I'm going to explain who Daniel Burke is. Daniel Burke is like the left PR department for the Schiller. So Schiller is trying to always recruit people. And Daniel Burke is like the guy who faces leftward to recruit leftists, right? He was roped in with Caleb or whatever, right? And what happened is that they presented themselves to us in the following way. Like, one, they're pro-China and pro-Russia. That's so cool. They're like the Belt and Road Initiative that China's doing. We have this idea for that, where it's, we want that, but we are super enthusiastic about that. And that's more the energy we want, like China, right? That's like our view on policy. And they also would talk about, they had very good foreign policy views. CGTN would platform them. They were welcomed in Russia. And then then the second thing is that they also were not big fans of the British Empire, but understand we had that position independently of them. It's just that this was another thing that they seemed to have that was similar to us, right? And we liked this idea of an American identity versus the British Empire and the imperialist tendency that America has become, because we think that is an effective way to make communism applicable and relevant in the American national context. So we're like, oh, this can be like a Sun Yat-sen type of thing, where he's not a communist, but it's like this. We were very open-minded. And then the third thing what was it? We liked the thing about unleashing the productive forces, in contrast to the degrowth stuff. And that's always been a feature of Marxism, which is accelerating the productive forces. Now, where did that accent come from my end? I liked the idea of technological acceleration because I have independent reasoning here, okay? But I am coming from accelerationist circles a little bit, right? I don't have the same views as them. There used to be Cave Twitter with Ed Berg and the unconditional accelerationists and all these other kind of landy. And there was a strong sentiment of unleash the productive forces, unleash technology, instead of this technological pessimism and degrowth stuff. Restore back to Marxism, this kind of technological dimension of optimism. Like LaRouche would talk about, at least as they would present it to us, he would be like, oh yeah, we're going to have 5 billion or 5 trillion people and fully unleash the... We thought that was cool, right? We liked that. We thought a lot of the green politics was Malthusian, which is true. That's actually real. Malthusianism is a real tendency among the capitalist class. Marx talked about it. He talked about how Thomas Malthus was the premier ideologist of the capitalist class at that time. That didn't change. You study the development of eugenics, look at what they're saying at Davos with depopulation and stuff, it's all real, right? So there were like some similarities that allowed us to find common ground with Schiller, and who is very much aggressively promoting LaRouche and LaRouche's ideas. But understand something very carefully. Both myself and Jackson had a pre-established position that predated this contact with Daniel Burke that we ended up having, right? Which culminated in a conference we did at the Schiller Institute, where I gave a speech defending South Africa's EFF, which Schiller hates, and Hegel, which Schiller hates, and Alexander Kojev, which Schiller hates. Now, and I promoted class struggle. I talked about the proletarian class. I touched upon all of the key things that distinguished myself from them. And why did I do that? Because I was starting to detect, even at that time, I was getting pretty shocked at something that disturbed me, which was that they were trying to recruit from infrared, right? There were some infrared gorillas that were telling, oh yeah, they were. I was like, hold on, give me a fucking second here. It's like, I didn't understand how it worked online, where if I'm friendly with Daniel Burke and we're trying to find common ground, like that means I endorse them and I want you guys to fucking join their cringe cult where they sit around and fucking do this cringe choir shit. And they're like, they do all this weird shit, this cringe stuff. Because it's like a cult, basically. And they tell you you can't listen to music or like pop music. It's demonic. And they try to fucking... I wasn't having all of that. I just super common ground on the basis of like policy ideas and foreign policy views and things. But I like, there was always a presumed distance where, no, motherfucker, we're not going to actually like allow this to affect our fucking lives. But there were some gorillas that were like drinking the fucking LaRouche Kool-Aid because they needed a real life organization to join, even though I told them to join the CPUSA. And I was getting bothered by that. So I wanted to very clearly distinguish myself from Schiller and the LaRouche people as a message to my community that, hey, if you don't fucking take my willingness to try to collaborate with people who I think are sincere anti-imperialists to mean that I endorse them or they're getting my seal of approval, because they're not. In fundamental ways, they're not. Anyway, I am so stupid, and this was the biggest fucking mistake of my life, literally, is ever affiliating with these people. Because for some reason, millennials, who I think are their target demographic anyway, are super fascinated by LaRouche, and it's this whole thing, this whole cult has this whole history, which is so interesting and whatever, from the 1980s. And it's, wow, I'm literally so naive in the sense that, like, Daniel Burke would literally just tell me his views on shit, and we would see what they think about things and be like, okay, sure. And little did I fucking know that just from associating with this guy, we would be pinned for life as a LaRoucheite conspiracy by this obscure 1980s cult, apparently. Like, all of these things about LaRouche. Oh my God, he's the CIA, and he's fucking in South Africa, and he's whatever. I don't fucking know, man. I don't fucking know. Like, what, you think I fucking know about all these details about Lyndon LaRouche? And I took them at face value. It was a big mistake, and not because of them even, because I could deal with them, obviously. They're no threat to me. It's a mistake because these crazy parapolitics, and this is why Johnny Socialism latched onto LaRouche shit. No-brainer. I first learned about LaRouche through the parapolitics community, who always used to ironically, and as like a marker of hipster taste, they'd be like, LaRouche, that crazy guy, he actually was saying some shit that was uncovering stuff. So it was like kind of vogue to like not seriously endorse LaRouche, but be like, this reveals some shit, like LaRouche, there's more to LaRouche than it seems. That's why I started taking LaRouche a little seriously from a distanced way, like not in the sense that, oh, he's a great theorist or he's a great thinker in the sense that I agree with him philosophically, but more in the sense of, oh, there's more to this than it lets on. But when we started talking to Daniel Burke and when we did that event at Schiller where we spoke, a new narrative started to get crafted where the whole movement and whole phenomena of infrared specifically was being spun as this is just a LaRouche thing. This is like LaRouche rehashed. This is LaRouche all over again. And we didn't know how powerful that narrative would be. Because we didn't see the Schiller Institute as extremely powerful or significant at all. To this day, people like associate us with LaRouche in these really in a really over exaggerated way because of a very meaningless friendship we had with Daniel Burke specifically. And I mention him because there really was no one else. Pesto Mime was like a fucking troll. Talked about Lysenko's weed, but Pesto Mime was not like this influential LaRoucheite agent. Also, he got kicked out. But beyond Pesto, like Daniel Burke was really the only one that we like knew in any real way, and like in the sense that he was like friendly with us. But LaRouche jacking, that's a good word. Like they started LaRouche jacking us because these crazy mind-fucked millennial parapolitics schizoids, it was perfect for them. We were this mysterious new thing, and they were like, oh, the connection, the line from Daniel Burke to us, and our connection was like totally superficial. You could just see it on a stream. There's nothing secret. There's nothing, no planning, no strategizing, no nothing, just fucking, literally that stream, he was like, shit like that. He went on Jackson's show. It's like, whatever. once I started seeing these crazy, I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to keep a friendly distance from these people. I started learning. I had people who joined and then got disillusioned, and they were like, on the inside, Schiller does nothing but shit talk you. This was in actually 22, late 22. They're like, these LaRouche guys at Schiller, they do nothing but shit talk you. RTSG was already waging war against them, which I didn't like, but they did it anyway. Looking back, it was great they did that. But I was like, why are we just going to war with everyone, burning all bridges? Actually, it turns out RTSG was right, because one guy who had ended up attending one of their events or meetings, their choir, they wanted him to fucking sing. He was like, why am I fucking singing? He was like, and then he was like, all right, fuck this. Then he came and reported to me what was going on in there. He was like, listen, they talk mad shit about you. Like, they don't like you. They want to take your community, and they think that you're a nut job. They don't like your philosophy. They don't like your outlook. They think infrared is filthy and disgusting and evil, and that you're like guerrilla stuff. It's like primitive, and that you're like a barbarian and the Genghis Khan stuff. They really didn't fuck with me at all, but they believed in this strategy of taking my followers and recruiting them into their cult. Okay? I still didn't say a fucking thing because they didn't say anything in public. I kept my mouth shut and I just started ignoring them. That's why we didn't do a second event. I just started not wanting to collaborate with them at all. Like how Daniel Burke used to come on stream. No more. That kind of thing. Fast forward of our years of ignoring Schiller to the founding of the ACP. By this time, we didn't give a fuck about Schiller or Daniel Burke. They were irrelevant to us. Completely irrelevant. Okay? But during Danny Shaw's betrayal on January 17th, something really interesting happened. I was doxxed and accused of running guns to Haiti. And Daniel Burke comes out of the woodwork and he goes, who would have guessed that an organization that's learning from Heidegger would have such an ugly, rotten thing? And that's the epitome of who Lyndon LaRouche was. Lyndon LaRouche was a guy who would have a slight philosophical disagreement with someone, and then very viscerally and maliciously attack them on a personal level, circumventing all personal decency because of some stupid, small intellectual disagreement. Meaning LaRouche didn't believe there was this unspoken texture of dense social conventions and honor and anything that was beyond intellectual disagreements. For LaRouche, the direct philosophical opinions and views you have directly determine every aspect of your existence, is what he believed. That is why every LaRouche organization is a cult. Because literally, from the music you listen to, everything has to reflect exactly your specific intellectual opinion and view. And there's no room for humanity. There's no room for charity, and there's no room for any degree of ambiguity or mercy upon the other. Every fucking aspect has to be directly pure formally. And I used to think LaRouche got done dirty with how much shit is talked about him and made up about him. But honestly, it is karma. You know what? I'll say it. It's fucking karma. I tend not to want to speak ill of the dead, but that's what he did to everyone else. He slandered the shit out of everyone else and made up so much bullshit about Mao and the Soviet experience. And he would just make shit up and pull it out of his fucking ass. Much like the millennial parapolitics people that are doing that to him, that's karma, because that's all he ever fucking did. He would make so many leaps. Yeah, he'd be like, Khomeini is a British drug dealer. He would, and you'd be like, LaRouche, where are you getting this from? It's the Platonic principle of, it's deductive logic. It's like he felt like he could get away with telling empirical lies, as if the empirical didn't matter, and all that mattered was his philosophical antagonism with others. So the empirical details don't matter. They're like, you have to see the circle instead of the squares, whatever they would fucking say. The details don't matter. Only the Platonic circles matter. Whatever fucking triangle bullshit they believe. I don't fucking know. They have this autistic shape bullshit. Leibniz. So they're like, literally, you're getting doxxed, you're getting slandered as an arms trafficker. That doesn't fucking matter because we disagree with you about Heidegger and your views. So no human decency matters. It's disgusting. They are freaks. They're like, you could literally be in the head and we're going to fucking say that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. The shapes matter. That's just an empirical bullshit, muddy, urgent filth. all that matters is that you disagree with me on Leibniz. It's precisely, I don't even want to say this because it's so bad, but it's like you could be a victim of the worst crime. You could be a fucking victim. And you'll go to LaRouche and be like, we need to report this crime. And he's like, it's when you think about it, it's your fault because of your fucking views on Leibniz. It's because of your views on Leibniz that this happened to you. So you deserve it. You should reflect on your views on Leibniz. That's the type of shit they're on. If I was thrown in prison, Daniel Burke would come out in public and be like, that's what happens when you don't agree with us on the critique of Hegel. That's what happens when you're a Hegelian. I could literally be assassinated, and Daniel Burke would come to my funeral and try to give a speech to people about why Jacques Lacan leads to death. I find that so disgusting and contemptible about them. And for diplomatic reasons relating to the minimal decency I thought Daniel Burke had extended toward us, I have never voiced my actual views on what I think about them. And what did I gain from that? I gained being called a LaRoucheite constantly because I never fucking wanted to throw what I thought was a friend of Jackson and I under the bus. But after what he fucking did, when he thought our party was at its dire hour and we were going to get dismantled, when he thought we were done for, he came out of the woodwork and was pissing on our grave that he thought we were dead. He showed his true colors, really. I feel like that summarizes my view on LaRouche. Really, that's it. The things that we agree with LaRouche on, it's just Michael Hudson. That's the secret. And LaRouche stole everything worthwhile when it comes to economics from Michael Hudson. Michael Hudson's the real genius.
I would go on this website, uselectionatlas.org, and browse historical American election results, because that's what I said Dennis King, who spent a long time covering LaRouche and his movement. So Lyndon LaRouche was born on September 8th in America.
A whole fucking biography for this guy.
And around the world. And now in his 40s and living in New York City, was fully believed that they were capable of this, and even forced to listen to.
Yeah, I just want to get to the part where it's relevant to us or me.
Organizations. Their goal became to install a fascist regime in America with Lyndon LaRouche as leader and mobilize the country for a campaign of global conquest. LaRouche studied how Hitler and Mussolini came to power and concluded that he had to forge a coalition of American political, economic, and military elites willing to sponsor the overthrow of the American Republic and its militant social.
You know what's sad is I don't even think this is true, but why should I be a cuck and defend this guy when he created a movement of people that just slander everyone, and they're getting slandered, and what a cuck I would be if I would defend them from slander.
One of the best private intelligence services in the world, Richard Morris, executive assistant to Judge William Clark, when the latter was President Reagan's national security advisor, met with LaRouche several times, and with LaRouche aides on numerous...
Because again, they don't believe truth matters. They think that all that matters is Leibnizian circles. So that's why they're such an optical fucking disaster. They don't even defend themselves. I'd literally ask Daniel Burke, I'd be like, bro, is it true that you guys worked with the CIA? And he was like, no. And he would explain in detail what it was. I was like, oh, so you weren't trying to attack the Soviet Union? And he was like, no. I was like, why don't you fucking say that in public? Why are you letting these lies? And he'd be like, it's not important. The empirical stuff, it's really the bigger... They would just say shit like that. I'd be like, why would I want to associate with people who don't even fucking care about facts? They think that you can just intuit everything from first principles and that you have the key to the universe. You don't actually have to actually investigate reality in any way.
Aspects of the Iran-Contra affair in the...
But to be fair, yeah, I'm sure there's fucked up things about LaRouche. I'm sure there is. They hated the Black Panthers, and already there's a fundamental schism. Of course, Black Panthers every day, all day, over the fucking cringe glasses-wearing shites. Yeah, I went there.
Space weaponry using nuclear fusion. There's a lot more to say about LaRouche. He cultivated connections among mobsters in the Teamsters Union. He went to prison for 5 years.
Is that Nico Blick from GTA 4? Fuck.
Because he instructed his followers to commit massive financial fraud and scam a ton of people out of their money, and LaRouche turned his attention to electoral politics, and he and his followers... So that begs the question of why Hinkle and Haas seem to really like LaRouche. Now,
yeah, it begs the question. It's not like we actually, we're very superficial about it in the sense, we're pretty clear about what about LaRouche we liked. Turns out to be things that have nothing to do with LaRouche uniquely, but happen to be things LaRouche believed that also were in line with what Marxists believed. That's the whole mystery of our affiliation with LaRouche, is we would just tell Daniel Burke, we're like, oh, y'all like China? That's great. We like China. Wow. Very profound. Like, we would literally just, all the things that we had minimal common ground, we'd be like, great. But the things that were uniquely LaRouche, nothing. That's the thing. The things that were uniquely LaRouche's philosophy, we had nothing in common with. Literally nothing. Only the things that he stole from other traditions interested us.
Nowadays, MAGA communists usually don't talk directly about LaRouche and Eddie Smith from Midwestern.
Oh yeah, because we're hiding it, Brandon. That's what he's trying to insinuate here. Like, we're hiding the truth. We're hiding it. We're not talking about this glaring thing. Like, we're not talking about it, but it's like low-key the subtext of everything they say and do. Fucking crazy.
Marx just outright denies that MAGA communists are connected to LaRoucheism in any way, but Haas and Hinkle are very much.
They're not. They're really not. Because the connection in question was the Schiller Institute conference. That's it.
Midwestern Marx just outright denies that MAGA communists are connected to LaRoucheism in any way, but
they're not. Really, they're not.
Haas and Hinkle are very much fans of LaRouche. LaRouche is one of the most profound theorists and thinkers.
How do I explain diplomatically to how do I give Daniel Burke a bone and be like, okay, it's literally a fucking participation trophy. I'm literally saying LaRouche maybe are when it comes to philosophy, but I really like the idea of building trillions of nuclear fusion reactors and building a fucking land bridge from Alaska to Siberia. That sounds really good. I was like, he's quite a profound, one of the most profound thinkers of policy. I gave him policy, like a policy idea. Big ideas going on. Notice what I omitted, though. That's one of the things. He doesn't have, this guy Brandon has no discernment or intelligence. Because you learn the truth by what I omit here. Not philosophy, not politics, not organization, not strategy, not analysis even, just policy. Think about that think about how vague and nebulous that is. Can fucking mean anything.
Of a policy.
Who's against nuclear fusion? Who's against building up the productive forces? Who's against it? Who's against the land bridge? It's all great. Wonderful. If only there was a way to get to that without the choir singing and the triangles and the fucking like dumb, stupid cult shit that they do. That's literally fucking meaningless.
According to Haas, and Hinkle has been associated in the past with the Schiller Institute, an organization founded.
Dude, Schiller, you're making it seem like it's like an anti-Semite's logic. When anti-Semites are like, it just so happens to be incidents. When you think about it, I learned this. That guy called Marx. It's just a coincidence, but it's like he's Jewish. Just so happens. It's like something that follows. I looked up Marx's parents. They were Jewish too. That follows logically from Marx being Jewish. Of course his parents would be Jewish. Then this guy's first they're just in isolation talking about LaRouche. Uh-oh, what a coincidence. They went to a Schiller Institute event. No, you're mixing up the causes here. The cause of our interaction with LaRouche is Daniel Burke from the Schiller Institute. So there's no coincidence here. It's a very specific chain of events. No coincidences. It's a very clear chain of events.
Widow, which continues to promote ideology, and even though Haas.
Oh, really? Wow. It's almost like we just randomly woke up and started being diplomatic to Daniel Burke for no reason about LaRouche.
Hinkle may now avoid directly mentioning.
Yeah, we avoid mentioning LaRouche because we're hiding. We're not mentioning him, but he's definitely has this enduring significance for us. Clear, enduring, and lasting relevance for us. We're just not mentioning him, though. But he still has this clear, enduring relevance and significance for us that we're just hiding. Okay, I'm so scared to mention LaRouche. He's just the secret patriarch behind our whole movement. We don't mention him because he's not fucking relevant. Fuck Lyndon LaRouche. Fuck Schiller, too.
Which's influence is plain in their ideology and rhetoric. Recall earlier all this talk about the British quote-unquote ruling America, which both.
Yeah, I didn't say that, though. What did I read what I actually said, you fucking idiot?
Haas and Hinkle have espoused a British financial cabal occupies America. We have to liberate Canada from the British.
Oh my God, what a coincidence. America was founded in a war of independence. That's our only revolutionary tradition. It's just oh my God, I just looked at the textbook and oh my God, it was a war against the British Empire. Holy fuck, maybe if we're trying to remain faithful to the American revolutionary tradition, we're gonna play up America's founding revolutionary identity and contradistinction to the fucking British Empire, which we also just happen to inherit with the ascendancy of the American empire in the post-war period. Wow, dude, you're such a genius.
British globalists? What's all this business about British globalists and British financial cabals?
What's all this business? I don't know. Did you watch my fucking speech? Because I explained it pretty. Again, it's the false posturing that this guy's this curious detective who just so happens to stumble upon these conclusions because he's such a good detective, when in reality, he has shoehorned the conclusion already into the premise so as to lead him to this false conclusion, right?
It comes straight from LaRouche.
No, it doesn't. It comes from, okay, just do a devil's advocate thought experiment in your head. If we are trying to affirm some kind of American national identity that is based in our revolutionary tradition, meaning we don't want to reject socialist patriotism, what would follow as far as who America's historical enemies are, its founding, and the circumstances surrounding America becoming a global imperialist power? Wouldn't it be a compelling narrative, at the very least, for us to say that this was a result of the betrayal of our revolutionary founding, and that in the process of that betrayal, we actually joined up with the British Empire, betraying our, like, the fundamental foundations of our nation? It's, dude, it's literally such a compelling narrative that it's in fucking Red Dawn. The Soviets in Red Dawn, when they're rounding up people into camps, literally have it played on loudspeakers that imperialist America has betrayed its revolutionary foundations. Just put two and two together, you fucking idiot. It's a logical narrative. But it's William Z. Foster's parents were Fenians. Like, are you stupid? There's nothing. This doesn't come from LaRouche, you idiot. Where do you fucking think LaRouche got it, you fucking moron? LaRouche got it from reading American thinkers at the turn of the century. LaRouche got it from reading history, and he took it. He didn't invent it, you idiot. It's always been part of America's revolutionary national identity. Where did you think LaRouche got it? Like, he didn't invent this shit, you idiot.
Is a word LaRouche used all the time to refer
It's like people who think LaRouche invented the idea of unleashing the productive forces. No, he didn't.
Sinister, shadowy elements, which he and his followers were supposedly fighting. He would refer to the British oligarchy and claim that Britain is the #1 enemy of the United States, and this usage of British has an even older history. During World War II, the Nazis diffused anti-Semitism.
Remember when LaRouche was like I remember LaRouche was a meme on, like, RiceTube? Yeah, I remember that shit. People don't understand that was the context. You don't get it. He was always a joke. Like, he was always a joke. LaRouche was always a fucking joke to us. Literally always a joke.
With anti-condemning English.
This is taking his... Like, I wish that... Does that guy know what heights the meme has been brought to? Look at this. This video probably has 50,000 views by now. Like, it started out as a meme, and now it's here. That's fucking crazy.
High finance and depicting the British Empire as the engine of Jewish rule, and this theme has persisted among neo-Nazis to this day. This is pretty clearly where LaRouche got the idea of British finance ruling the world. He just excised the anti-Semitism.
It's like he's wearing sunglasses. It's just funny. I don't know.
And developed his own elaborate conspiracy theory to suit his particular brand of fascist politics. One must begin with LaRouche's conspiracy theory of history, which highlights the role of deception and concealment in the transmission of ideology through the centuries. In the secrets known only to the inner elites, LaRouche claims that he and his followers represent a 3,000-year-old faction of Neoplatonic humanists locked in mortal struggle with an equally ancient oligarchy. To avoid repression by the dominant oligarchy, the humanists through the centuries have...
This video is called The Nonsense of MAGA Communism, by the way, and now we're talking about a 3,000-year-old Assassin's Creed thing. We're to blame for this. This is our fault.
Concealed their ideas in much the way that an espionage agent conceals his identity. Indeed, the humanist is a combination of spy and underground organizer. LaRouche cites the example of St. Augustine, who supposedly adopted Christianity as his cover for organizing a united front against the oligarchy.
No, I'm on 2x speed, by the way, and he's reading this. He's taking a lot of time to read this. It's really important for understanding ACP, apparently.
Assures us that they destroyed all past societies they captured.
Yeah, ACP as in Assassin's Creed Pangea. Because we're going 3,000 years into the past. We may as well go fucking tens, hundreds of millions of years ago when the fucking Pangea existed.
From Atlantis through Rome, 3,000 years ago, their headquarters were in Babylon. After they engineered its fall, they shifted their command post westward to Rome, then Venice, and finally...
What is this? Why? All we did was pick up trash. It's what did we do? All we did. That's all we did. What is this?
To London, unable to stop humanist networks led by Benjamin Franklin and Friedrich Schiller from launching the Industrial Revolution, the oligarchs struggle to slow it down through their control of speculative capital, which allegedly feeds like a vampire on productive capital. But the oligarchs today are extremely worried because productive capital has begun to link up with the powerful, streamlined humanist conspiracy represented by the NCLC. According to LaRouche, human history is Assassin's Creed. And
Bro, I've seen people in the comments be like, great video. This is like really good. What?
malevolent cabal has been oppressing humanity for eons and struggling with heroic Neoplatonic humanists, and he claimed that this cabal today manifests as a British financial cartel which controls America.
Oh, okay, so all of that, and then you finally got to the thing that vaguely sounds familiar to what I said, which was the Anglo-American elite slide in my speech. Okay, so apparently you have to believe in a 3,000-year-old battle of a Platonic Neo-Platonic humanists in Babylon. Apparently you need to believe that shit to accept the very simple fact that there was a profound degree of admixture, both in blood and in finance, between the ascendant American capitalist monopoly class and the established British financial oligarchy. Apparently, in order to even entertain the conclusion that there was some continuity between the British Empire world capitalist hegemon and the one that literally came right after, you must believe in the Babylonian 3,000-year-old neo-humanist. Fuck, man. What is this?
And bleeds the productive economy dry.
Like, fuck, no one thinks with awareness. Speaking of 3,000 years, it's like the Anunnaki. I must be descendant of the Anunnaki. I'm one of the only ones with my third eye fucking open, because apparently that's what it takes to have the bare minimum of conscious awareness to understand how illogical the line of argument we're being presented here is. Like, you have to believe all that crazy shit LaRouche thought to accept the simple fact that there was an Anglo-American establishment, even though that idea didn't originate with LaRouche at all and is actually true from a factual, historical level.
This is just a variation on the traditional fascist idea about a secret financial cabals ruling the world.
I don't think it's fascist. I don't. I think it's just a fucking another crazy cult in America. I really think so. I don't think there needs to be a comparison to fascism, because fascism literally just said the Jews.
And sapping nations of their productivity and vitality. But this specific form originates with Lyndon LaRouche, and it's obvious.
Yeah, again, it was Marxists who opposed the productivity of the material base with the capitalist elite, who were clearly retarding the forces of production and stagnating them and sapping them, which is what Marx said, actually. In Capital Volume 3, he said the rentier, the financial capitalists, they are parasites upon the productive capitalists. That's what Marx said in Volume 3. He said that in Volume 3. Why are you calling this a fascist notion? I don't know.
That this is where Haas and Hinkle...
Again, he's taking advantage because people watching this aren't educated about Marxism, let alone Marxism-Leninism. So when we espouse things that you need Marxist education and Marxist-Leninist education to understand the context of, instead of him introducing them to that, he's actually, this is what's behind it. It's this Babylonian thing from thousands of years ago.
Are getting this idea? I don't know to what extent they believe this literally. I think British is more of a signifier. It's esoteric of fascist rhetoric, which allows them to signal their affinity for LaRouche, a fascist cult leader who tried...
Yeah, you know what? You're so right. At the Free America conference with Jackson, we needed to signify our affiliation with LaRouche. Look at him, he's doing the Hitler salute. Look at that. But we needed to, that was the goal of that whole conference, was to give coded subliminal messages to Charmhole about Lyndon LaRouche.
Building laser death beams to destroy the USSR.
Wow, that's another thing. Wow.
So that's Lyndon LaRouche. But there is yet another major intellectual influence on MAGA communism, one which MAGA communists acknowledge.
To be fair, I would say that Infrared and myself are definitely influenced by the philosopher Alexandr Dugin. Like, that would be fair to say. But the party is not, in any way. The party is not. I am one of the only people in the party who has read Dugin. I think I'm the only one in leadership who's actually read Dugin. Maybe Jackson has, I don't know. But granted, I'm chairman, but Dugin's ideas are not on our reading list. They're not mandatory, but I have a very specific dialogue with Dugin's philosophy, which is out in the open. It's not a secret, and you can read it yourself.
Much more openly, and that's Alexandr Dugin. So let's talk about him. Alexandr Dugin was born on January 7th, 1962. His father was a colonel in Soviet intelligence, and the details of his earlier life are unclear and contradictory for whatever reason. Dugin began his political activity in the 1980s, first joining a secret group of Moscow intellectuals who dabbled in occult neo-Nazism, which is a great start. One of Dugin's contributions to the group
The Russian underground dissident scene was super edgy, and it was edginess. When you understand neo-Nazism in Russia, you have to understand it as a concrete thing. You can't just say this like group of edgy LARPers trying to be shocking and provocative. That's the essence of neo-Nazism. You have to actually analyze, importantly, violence and rhetoric against Russia's minorities. That was what made neo-Nazism decisively a real phenomenon, right? It was about the sentiment against Russia's national minorities, ethnic minorities, which Dugin never participated in.
Group was translating the work of Italian fascist philosopher Julius Evola, who famously called himself a...
It would not be too unfair to say Evola was a fascist, but the tradition of he's coming from was traditionalism, which comes from René Guénon. Dugin absolutely engaged with this tradition, but he always actually rejected fascism as a concrete historical phenomenon. Like, he rejected Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy, always.
Super fascist. Later in the 1980s, Dugin moved away from neo-Nazism and toward Russian ultranationalism. He joined the anti-Semitic ultranationalist organization and sat on its central council. As the Soviet Union approached collapse, Dugin visited the West and made contact with leading figures in the European New Right, and the experience appears to have greatly influenced the development of Dugin's political philosophy.
I want to show you an interesting article Dugin wrote about his views on the European. So he wrote this in 2004. He said, I used to hate Leninists, yada, but something changed. All the people that were the worst scum started denouncing Lenin. But here he says something I like, where I found it interesting. He said, Lenin declared he was a magic Eurasian dwarf who raised jihad on the world of exploiters, smashed the brain of the Philistine, mobilized the nation for total upheaval. In Europe, I met many Guenonians and Indians. Some of them were sloppy schizophrenics, others obedient and politically correct Philistines. They work in banks, marketing. They're a bunch of misfits and capable of original thinking, deeds. The only thing they do is whine and squabble over trivia and grumble around at the world around, which they don't understand and are pathologically afraid of. So it sounds like a lot of this contact he makes with the European New Right does not reflect his expectations. The actual he doesn't really. He starts saying that the Red Brigades in the RAF is 100 times more attractive than the majority of these European traditionalists. So it's interesting because it's not a one-sided picture. This guy's trying to paint a one-sided picture. It's just, if you know who Dugin is, it's not true that he is a far right. It's not true. He is a uniquely Russian thinker, and the Western political axis of political difference doesn't make full sense in the Russian context. For example, the National Bolshevik Party. I was not always confident in saying this, but I am now. National Bolshevik Party in Russia was most definitely a radical left-wing party, and it still has that association to this day. No one in Russia associates it with Nazism. No one. I asked about the flag, by the way. I literally asked. I said, look, why is that flag looking like that? And why is it called National Bolshevik? It sounds like National Socialist. They told me, was this provocateur who was trying to mock the red-brown accusations that were coming from the new Yeltsin elites. So he did this to troll them, basically, is what I was told. Maybe they were wrong, but that's what I was told. But I know for a fact that they were a left-wing phenomena in Russia. Absolutely they were. If you go to Russia, travel there and talk to people, you will learn the truth. They are associated with the radical left. Always were. Even ultra-left. Actually, we sympathize more with the KPRF, but KPRF are much more moderately left-wing compared to these guys. These guys were radical anarchists in a way. So it's very much misunderstood thing in the West because of their name and their flag.
In 1993, he co-founded the National Bolshevik Party, National Socialism, National Bolshevism, MAGA Communism, same shit. Dugin.
Oh man, really no. In the case of the National Bolsheviks, it's so stupid. Like, why would you show the ACP's
1993, he co-founded the National Bolshevik Party, National Socialism, National Bolshevism, MAGA Communism.
But this is the ACP logo. This is not a MAGA communist logo. What are you talking about?
Same
also,
shit.
The National Bolshevik thing was deliberate trolling. Okay, fine. But why ACP? What did we do? Oh, because I'm philosophically influenced by Dugin. I got it. Yeah. I guess that makes everything Nazi. That's really brilliant reasoning there. Don't even read what I said about Dugin. Just do this thing of this logical fallacy of guilt by association, and that's all you need to do.
Dugin's career as an intellectual took off in the 1990s, particularly with his publication of The Foundation of Geopolitics in 1997, which quickly became influential among Russian nationalists and elite military.
So he goes, it's so funny, like National Socialism is the same as national. No, it's not. It's a fundamentally distinct phenomenon because the National Bolsheviks were not engaging in violent pogroms against minorities, and they also sociologically and materially had nothing in common with Nazism. Only aesthetically, there seemed to be something with the flag and the name. But materially speaking, according to the analysis of the Comintern in the 1930s, no. Fascism is a specific phenomenon.
Circles, and his ideology is basically just Russian imperialist nationalism, calling for a vast Russian empire which absorbs all of the former Soviet Union, dominates Europe, and drives the US back to the Western Hemisphere.
God forbid NATO gets abolished.
Western sources are sometimes prone to exaggerating Dugin's influence in Russia and making it sound as though Dugin is writing Russian foreign policy, which he isn't. But Dugin is...
Oh yeah, Dugin has no influence. Sure, believe what you want. Sorry, anyway.
Still a prominent intellectual with a good deal of influence in the Russian political and military establishments. He is a leading intellectual of the ultra-nationalist far right in Russia, which...
No, he's not. No, he's not. No, he's not. That would be Antonovsky. Again, dude, it's not true. It's not fucking true. Like, I try to not be a bullshitter, and I'm just going to tell you the truth about what's going on in Russia's political scene. If Dugin was ever affiliated with the far right, that was an older generation. There's a new red-white war going on in Russia's cultural intellectual sphere about the legacy of Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution, with the new far right being like this. That all comes from the guys from the Telegram, Sons of the Monarchy, led by a guy named Antonovsky. And on the left side is Zakhar Prilepin, Comrade Zakhar Prilepin. He is the bulwark of defending the integrity and history of Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet era and communist ideas in general in the literary, cultural, and intellectual philosophical scene, I would say. And Dugin is not in the middle, but he is closer to Comrade Zakhar. He is closer. He is closer. Not all the way there, but he's more sympathetic. That is why Dugin likes me and Jackson. He doesn't buy into the far, at least not fully. So there is a far right in Russia. Dugin is not the leader of the far right in Russia. Because also, there's a few things the far right in Russia is characterized by. One is the historical revisionism, anti-Soviets, anti-communism. That doesn't characterize Dugin at all. The second thing is, this is the most important thing, I would argue, because it has more material significance. This kind of Russia as a white European identity versus Eurasianism. And Dugin is much more the latter. He's fully the latter. Dugin rejects the notion of a Russian ethno-state, nation-state. He wants to embrace all of Russia's ethnic and national minorities into one Eurasian identity that includes all of them. And that makes him distinct from the far right, because the far right is playing up on a lot of anti-immigrant and anti-minority sentiments and ethnic hatred and ethnic exclusion about Muslims and about all these minorities and so on. And Dugin is left-wing with respect to that. He's Eurasian. He's a Eurasian. There are so many nuances here, but Dugin is not the leader of the far right in Russia. That's a ridiculous claim.
Which makes it very strange that MAGA communists display such admiration for Dugin. Hinkle and Haas like Dugin.
No, because we actually understand Russia, and you don't know a fucking thing except Wikipedia, you fucking moron.
Really like Dugin. According to Haas, Marxist theory in the West is meaningless without the insights of Dugin. Jackson Hinkle called...
You know what? I'll fucking die on that hill. Every fucking philosopher who is able to advance human thinking forward under the nose of Western Marxists needs to be given tribute for inadvertently contributing to the advance of Marxist-Leninist thinking. And I actually will die on the hill that Dugin has contributed to that indirectly. And I argue elaborately why. I have an argument, and you haven't engaged with it. You just, again, are playing up this guilt by association shit instead of addressing the content of my argument.
Calls him one of the greatest men alive today, and Haas and Hinkle have conducted gushing interviews with Dugin himself a number of times.
Dugin is great. He is a great thinker and a great human being.
Affinity for Dugin goes a long way to explain the multipolarity fixation of MAGA communists are obsessed with
Yeah, it's all because of
multipolarity, and in their...
Right, that's so true. Why did I take interest in Dugin to begin with, though? Have you explored that, or no? It doesn't matter. All right, sure, whatever you say. You're the expert on me, more than me. I've been a fucking Marxist since 2010, but more about who I am and why I'm influenced by who I'm influenced by. It's all because of LaRouche and the Babylonian of a
geopolitical stance. They are very radically anti-Western. They present their anti-Westernism as a Marxist anti-imperialism, but in fact, it clearly stems from their far-right ideology. They see the liberal West as too woke, and they find ideological kinship with right-wing anti-liberal forces outside the West. Their anti-liberalism is fascist rather than Marxist.
How?
Their adulation of Dugin, who most definitely is not.
Okay, hold on. Their anti-liberalism is not Marxist, it's fascist. Hence, their friendliness with Dugin. But we have to establish Dugin as a fascist first, in order for that chain of reasoning to be correct.
An anti-imperialist thinker, and they mix it with this idea of the British financial cabal ruling the West, and hence their...
I think it's true that the capitalist class concretely does take the form of a developed imperial hegemony that originates with the British Empire, but has evolved since then, obviously. But it's not, it's become this diverse, all-inclusive, global, in the sense of representing all cultures. No, because the Turkish capitalist class is a comprador class. The capitalist class in all nations are comprador classes in the chain of the system of imperialism. And only the people that were there from the beginning have maintained their hegemony.
Their support for Russia and China to fight this international cabal. And Jackson Hinkle lives in Moscow now.
We support Russia and China to fight the concrete imperial hegemony that rules the world today, the American global empire. Not the British, the American global empire, because the British Empire was absorbed, or at least fused with, the global American empire. So there's no need to talk about the British Empire here.
Apparently,
very plainly, it's a unipolar hegemon led by the U.S., which we, of course, support Russia and China against. Now make the connection to fascism, please.
Permanently, take from that what you will. However,
okay, what, is Russia now LaRouche?
Haas and Hinkle are also invested in presenting a communist disguise. They claim to be Marxist-Leninist.
Dude, I was a Marxist-Leninist probably before you even fucking knew how to spell the name of Karl Marx. Okay, you probably spelled it as M-A-R-C-K-S before.
And they're invested in keeping up this pretense and proclaiming themselves the only true communist organization in America.
The disguise thing, it makes no sense. Why do we need a disguise when everyone is just openly being a fucking Hitler right now? We would get way more money and followers if we did that. Why would we need it? Why? What's the point of this theory that we're disguising ourselves?
Openly championing a far-right ultra-nationalist philosopher complicates...
But all the nuances are lost on you. It's like Dugin is not a neo-Nazi. He's not a fascist. He's just not a Marxist. No one said he's a Marxist. He's a non-Marxist thinker that I find to be very valuable in the synthesis of a new Marxism, or a new application of Marxism to the 21st century.
The idea that Dugin is a fascist is a myth invented by liberals.
Thank God you fucking at least have some familiarity with the actual argument, but you're not even citing the argument. You're just simplifying it.
And woke leftists, Dugin is just misunderstood and unfairly maligned.
That's true, and I explained how that is and why that is. Will you engage with that?
According to Haas, Hinkle also takes a deep offense at anyone who calls...
Hold on, you're not even going to engage with the argument?
Dugin a fascist? Hinkle characterizes Dugin as the foremost philosopher of multipolarity. He's not a fascist, he's a great anti-imperialist thinker. This is helped by the fact that Dugin himself denies that he's a fascist. So according to Dugin, he isn't a fascist, he just rejects modernity, the idea of progress, and the Enlightenment in an...
So did Ayatollah Khomeini and Hassan, by the way.
Entirely non-fascistic way.
Okay, just like Khomeini. Are you going to say Iran is fascist?
But whether you want to apply the label of a fascist...
He just said okay, so what are you going to say now? What's your argument? What's your counter-argument, Brandon?
Dugin's politics, and I think Dugin is definitely a fascist, but setting that aside...
Why are you setting that aside? Your whole argument hinges on the idea that he's a fascist in order to prove that we're wearing a communist disguise to promote fascism. Don't fucking run away from it now.
Aside, even if you dispute that Dugin is a fascist, he is undeniably far-right and ultra-nationalist, and...
No, but how is he far-right and ultra-nationalist? Dude, you don't know what you're fucking talking about. It's so frustrating. You've never been to Russia. You don't know anything about Russian politics. If you knew 1% anything about Russian politics, A, he's not far. The far-right people want to reverse and dismantle the whole legacy of communism, and they hate the non-white minorities. That's not Dugin. He's not far, okay? Second, the thing about ultranationalism, that can have two potential meanings. One is ethnic nationalism. That is indeed affiliated with the global right, but that's not Dugin. He's a Eurasianist. It's an inclusive kind of, it's not, he rejects nationalism. He rejects nationalism. He said nationalism is a European principle of the nation state. He says we support civilization states, which that's what he calls Russia is, because it's not one nation, according to him. So calling him an ultra-nationalist is wrong. Now, if you want to talk about he has great power projections for Russia, sure, but that's the only bare minimum of an anti-imperialist position you can have in Russia, because that's the position that is inversely proportional to the hegemony of basically the U.S. legacy of U.S. occupation and the restoration of Soviet power, basically. He doesn't say that as restoration of Soviet power, but the Russians who are patriotic, who want to expand Russia and in some way restore its territorial integrity, those are the consistent opponents of American unipolar hegemony. And they do not affirm any kind of racism, because it means mixing with more minorities and restoring Soviet-era diversity.
And this doesn't look like an ingenious 18D chess synthesis of Dugin's philosophy with Marxism.
But how would you know? Because you don't even know, I don't know if it would matter if you made an effort. I don't know if you have the cognitive capacity to even, how would you know? You don't even have the cognitive capacity to like actually follow through any kind of reading of what I've written on the matter. You don't know. Yes, it could very well be a really brilliant 18D chess synthesis or application of Dugin's ideas or interpretation of Dugin under the lens of Marxism. You wouldn't know, because you're not even intelligent enough to comprehend, apparently, the specific philosophical position I articulate.
And Hinkle want to portray, it just looks like two American far-right ultranationalists taking inspiration from a Russian far-right.
It looks like this. I haven't done any reading. I don't know anything about who Dugin is. I haven't read him. I haven't read what Haas has said about him. I didn't watch Haas's lectures about him. But it definitely looks this way. What a profound, brilliant line of argumentation here.
Ultranationalist. Before I wrap up the video, I want to talk about the nature of reactionary
Okay, wow. He really summed it up right there. He devoted roughly 10 minutes to Dugin. He wrapped it up by saying, it really looks like these are just two far-right guys who like this far philosopher. Mind you, I haven't actually engaged with anything they've said in any detail about him, and I don't know anything about him either, about where he stands within Russian politics today, or his specific philosophical outlook, or Haas's engagement with that philosophy. But it definitely does look this way if you're uninformed and ignorant about the actual details. It definitely looks this way if you're uninformed. Brandon, you're so smart. To an uninformed, uneducated person, it definitely looks this way. Wow, man. Brilliant expose on the ACP.
Politics, and how MAGA communism helps us to understand it. Reactionaries have something in common with leftists. They are discontent with the present state of things. They are disenchanted with the status quo. They feel aggrieved and frustrated. They believe that there is something deeply and fundamentally wrong about society. They feel anxious and upset about modern life. They have a sense of disempowerment and subjugation. But they believe that the answer is to return to older social forms. They think restoring some imagined vision of the past is going to solve their problems.
Yeah, we're totally going to return to the United American Republic, a United Republic of America, where we have this unity of the USA and Canada, and it's unleashing technology to an unprecedented degree and accelerating AI. And you look at our ACP party program, and it's just a total return to the past. That's what our party evokes.
And the problems of their society. They think the problem is a moral and spiritual degeneration, which they define as the subversion and corruption of the dominant culture. And they inevitably develop elaborate conspiracy theories and esoteric mythologies to explain their worldview. Because
yeah, that's totally our program. That's totally what it is.
As their worldview is devoid of scientific rationality, they think restoring and radically strengthening patriarchal norms, attacking disfavored groups, whether on the basis of ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexuality, eliminating rabble-rousers who divide the culture and nation with ideas like class struggle, they think all of this will rejuvenate society and restore lost glory. Fascism is different from socialism or Marxism in that it isn't really a single ideology as much as a class or collection of jettisoned the white ethno-nationalist characteristic and suited his form of fascism to the American context. But LaRouche's ideology was still very much fascist. There is some universe out there where conditions were different and LaRouche became the
Why? He doesn't even make an argument.
Fascist ruler of America, and that universe is horrifying. And
because LaRouche wanted unlimited power or something, right? What a fucking idiot. This is so stupid.
This is ultimately what MAGA communism is. It's an Americanized form of fascism with roots in the ideology of Lyndon LaRouche. And if you
who watches this video and sees this conclusion is, wow, oh my god, it all makes sense. This is a fucking form of fascism. Not Nick Fuentes and the actual Patriot Front people. Not the actual, like, rising, like, you know, it's not like I began with this conclusion and just allowed it to fucking bias every single fucking engagement with everything they've ever said. I just assumed it was true without proving it. I have successfully
been a detective and just uncovered this conclusion in a totally unbiased way. I totally didn't begin with it from the start.
Used with the ideas of a far-right, ultra-nationalist Russian philosopher. To MAGA communists, America is a country besieged by moral and cultural subversion,
When have we said subversion? Notice that. When did we say that?
orchestrated by a shadowy international financial cabal.
No, we said that there's a decay corresponding to the decay of capitalism, and that the ruling capitalist class is profiteering off of that. That's what we said. While we decay, they are sucking us dry like a vampire, just like Marx described Capital in Capital Volume 1.
Americans need to unite across class lines to defeat this cabal.
What do you mean? Our party says the future belongs to the working class. All it talks about is a united working class. When does ACP talk? Oh, you're talking about the Institute for a Free America with the Popular Front thing. That's not quite fascist class unity now, is it? It's just the same thing. But it's not even ACP. This guy's so fundamentally confused, all right? First of all, the Popular Front against monopoly capital is not class collaboration. It is the class leadership exclusively of the proletariat, of the whole people, and without recognition of their class distinctions. Only class that's recognized under the principle of the Popular Front is still just the proletariat. By contrast, fascist class unity gives explicit recognition to discrete different classes that are represented by specific institutions, and the unity is institutionalized. The class unity is institutionalized, okay? The Popular Front doesn't do that because it doesn't recognize at the level of political principle any class except the proletariat. Now, finally, the ACP only ever talks about the working class and the unity of the working class.
Like a glory age, which needs to be revived. For the Nazis, it was the image of the medieval German peasant, the idea of blood and soil. For the Italian fascists, it was the Roman Empire, whose glory and prestige they wanted to restore. For MAGA communists, I think their nostalgia is really directed toward this idealized conception of the post-war United States from the 1940s to the...
What? All right, the Nazis wanted to return to the Middle Ages. Mussolini wanted to return to the Roman Empire. And ACP wants to return to the 50s. There are multiple... I thought we were just going to wrap it up. This is going to take 5 minutes. But the issue is that when communists refer to fascism as reactionary, we don't literally think that Mussolini was really returning the Roman Empire. Because the idea of restoring lost past glory is not exclusively fascist. In the Stalin era, many references were made to the Tsardom of Muscovy and the greatness of the first kind of Russian Empire. It's not an exclusively fascist thing. China's doing it today when it comes to their great civilization. Mussolini was not reactionary because he talked about the Roman Empire. He was a reactionary because within the concrete historical circumstances of Italy at the time, he was actually trying to maintain a condemned status quo. And you think that just means you're conservative, but no. In a revolutionary era, when you are trying to sabotage and thwart revolutionary change, you are definitionally a reactionary. Reactionaries are not necessarily people who want to return to a specific point in time. They're also people who are trying to preserve a status quo amidst revolutionary change by violent means. That's the key word. The difference between a reactionary and a conservative is that conservatives might be skeptical of revolution, but only when they become revolutionaries do they become reactionaries. And that's what Mussolini and Hitler were. They were reactionaries, first of all, with respect to changes going on in the nature of capitalism. Both Mussolini and Hitler were champions. This is truth. They were reactionaries because they represented classical laissez-faire capitalism against the trend of more socialization and socialism. The Nazis pioneered privatization, for example. So it wasn't medieval Germany that they were reactionaries longing for. They were longing for an era where the working class had no seat at the table in politics. They were longing for an era where reforms didn't need to be made. They were longing for an era where capitalism had a classic form, instead of the one assumed after the New Deal in the US, for example, or in Britain under the Labour government, or in Germany that was being overseen by the Social Democrats. So they were reactionary with respect to that. Yeah, the heroic stage of capitalism. It was a very specific thing. It wasn't, the literal mythology was not materially relevant. They weren't literally turning into the Middle Ages.
The 1970s, this golden age of prosperity and national harmony, when America, an industrial powerhouse, and conservative cultural values reigned supreme, with the strong industrial working man who had the authority over his wife, this vision of the past weighs heavy.
Dude, what are you fucking, who had the authority over his wife? It's such a specific, strange thing to say. When labor was in a strategically much stronger position, there's nothing wrong with evoking imagery that that corresponds to a period when organized labor had much more power and leverage than it does now, okay? This specific weird stuff you're talking about, husbands and wives or whatever, just please keep it in your pants, dude. Nobody wants to hear about your fucking psychosexual analysis. We are interested in the twists and turns of class politics and the strategy for labor. I don't know what you're fucking talking about.
Heavily on the minds of the communists. Now, I do think that the post-war era was better than contemporary America in numerous ways. It really was an era of a broad prosperity and progress relative to now. America was a much more equal society back then. Unions were at their peak, and the balance of power between labor and capital was much more tilted.
We're not literally trying to return. If we were trying to return to that time, we wouldn't be communists. But it makes sense that maybe in some of our members' agitprop, maybe it reminds you of the 50s, because that was a time when labor had more political sovereignty. It had more political power. That doesn't mean we're literally trying to return to that. We aspire toward a future. We're not trying to go to the past.
Toward labor, the gains of economic growth and productivity were shared much more broadly. Housing was a lot more...
This way, if you're a Soviet communist, obviously the USSR was a socialist country. If you're in China, they evoke imagery from the Cultural Revolution. They evoke imagery in Russia today from Soviet times. It's not just because those were more radically left-wing periods. It's also because they're evoking imagery from a tradition where labor or the proletariat had more power. It doesn't mean they're literally trying to return to that.
Affordable. It was a genuinely
nebulous analysis of aesthetics, as all these fucking people do.
Golden age in many ways, but that's not what MAGA communists are focusing on. It's not the social democracy they care about. It's this vision of a culturally conservative and traditional America and industrial...
Dude, you realize I'm literally a fucking Arab? Like, I don't know what this is. You're showing me something that is fundamentally foreign to me. My tribal Arab traditional values are definitely not anchored, or definitely don't hinge upon whatever this you're showing me is. Okay? Please shut the fuck up and stop assuming that just because anyone has a sense of traditional culture, it means it's the 50s. The reason the 50s was so quote-unquote traditional was just because the working class had much more power and leverage than it does now. Therefore, society was built around its values, for the most part. For better and for worse, too, by the way. But it's just the truth. The Soviet Union today in Russia is seen as actually more traditional. Women may have had more... That's not true. That's why I don't understand where people are coming from. They're like, oh, Russia regressed for women's rights. I agree, because the rise of the sex industry and capitalism devastated opportunity, but women in Russia today are still very career-oriented. They're very much... That did not reverse. They're very much empowered at workplaces or whatever. Like Soviet times, though, people were dressed more modestly and there was more traditional family values than now. And there was more, it's just the truth. Capitalism does promote a type of fundamental disturbance of social harmony. It's just true. I'm not saying that the 50s, the status of women was great and that we should return to that. But I'm just attacking this idea that if you believe in traditional cultural values of some kind, that means you're trying to return to the 50s. That's not true.
The image of the heterosexual, industrial working man patriarch as opposed to the gay female or effeminate barista, this paradise lost and...
But you know what nuance you will never... And this is a good way to like wrap this up. You know the nuance you'll never accept in this dichotomy you're creating? What about the blue-collar female? What about her? What about the blue-collar, working-class woman? Why does she not exist to you? Why does it have to be the barista or the man? Why can't you also recognize that women wear jumpsuits too, and there are women truckers as well, and there are women in the blue-collar, working class as well? Because we recognize that, and it's not lost on us. But why is it lost on you? You'll be like, because the service sector is more coded female. And then, you know what? Why are you trying to reinforce that, though? Why are you defending that? It's a bad thing that we have this service sector that's made for women to enslave them, basically. And you're trying, it's like I'm the feminist now, and you're upholding this patriarchal system where what? We're just going to endorse quote unquote women's work now and institutionalize that? What do you mean?
And destroyed by sinister powers that be who have corrupted the culture and sapped the nation's productivity. That's
No, we've explained the breakdown of culture in pretty clear Marxist terms, all right? It's pretty clear that capitalism is for profit, and things that are for profit are not going to reflect the needs of a civilization, okay? So it's going to lead to a lot of problems and decay and confusion. It's going to devastate. Family life is going to be devastated if families can't make a fucking bottom line. They can't fucking survive materially.